Okay, welcome back to part 2 of the MS4 Construction Inspector training. I'm glad to have everybody back today. As I mentioned earlier and last week, would love to have participation. Actually, today has a lot of opportunities for participation. And I think one of the best ways for folks that are really new to this field is to hear from some of the folks that have been doing this for a long time. The other thing I want to encourage all of you to think about is that there is a construction committee that is part of the Colorado Stormwater Council. And that committee actually used to have a lot more inspectors in it. It doesn't necessarily need to be your MS4 coordinator that's part of that committee. It can be an inspector that attends. And that can be a really useful time to meet other inspectors, to talk about issues that you're seeing in the field. So I think that's a really great committee. Ashley Tucker, who is on again today, is really a good person. She's actually the one that's chairing that committee currently, although I think she's definitely looking for new people that are interested in helping out. And she's put her email in the chat box. So reach out to her, she can get you on the list. And I think it's a really great opportunity, especially for inspectors. And when it was first formed, it was all inspectors. And what I've noticed in the last few years is that we've really lost a lot of the inspector attendance there. And I think that's unfortunate for the group, because we really need to hear from people that are out in the field the most, and that's going to be the inspectors. Okay. All right, so a little summary of just what we covered in part 1 of this class, which was last week. If you, I think I only sent the link to the people that actually were in attendance for part 1. But if you missed part of the lecture, or you want to go back to any of it, we are posting it on the Colorado Stormwater Council website. I think I see that Jake just joined us, so maybe before noon today, we can just post in, or I can also do this during the break, is where this is going to be located within the website. I know sometimes I've had a hard time finding it. And so I can pull, it's located with the CIP training too, which is also something available that I mentioned last week that you can give your contractors that are working on CIP projects. And it's a recorded 4-hour session. It also works very well even for contractors that are not necessarily doing CIP projects. So that's another recording that's available, and you can give it to folks that are having compliance issues on their site. So if you have any questions on that during one of the breaks, go ahead and let me know. For anyone that didn't hear me in the beginning of today's session, if you haven't already, make sure you put your name in the chat box so we can take attendance there. And I think with Jake, because I don't think you were on for part 1, I'm just letting our admin know who's taking attendance to make sure to put you on. We are going to have the recording again available for both sessions, so you can also do that. Okay, so a little summary of what we've already covered. Last week, we talked about stormwater permitting in the big picture, and then we drilled down to the MS4 permitting, and then really drilled down to the construction program, which is just one element of 6 within that MS4 program, minimum program requirements. And then to drill down even further, we're really only discussing the construction oversight inspections. So really there's so many pieces to the MS4 construction program. And certainly if you're looking for training on other things from the Stormwater Council on different aspects of the permit, go ahead and let Ashley Tucker know. She's also co-chair, I think, of the council right now. So, or vice chair. And anyway, a good person to let her know if you're looking for other training opportunities on other topics. The other thing we did is we talked about the inspector scope. We're going to review that very briefly today before we start. And then as part of the inspector scope, we have to evaluate all pollutant sources. So those pollutant sources, we went through those for a lot of folks that are newer, wanted to make sure they had a good idea of what we mean by pollutant sources, because they have to go out and evaluate them. And then we discuss what control measures are associated with those pollutant sources and how construction is often phased, and that phasing is important to understand in order to understand the phasing of the control measures. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the inspection frequency, documentation, communication, and the non-compliance issues. Then we're going to get into enforcement. And this is where I'd love to hear from other folks about what their community is doing, because I think people can learn a lot from these kind of trainings. And they may be like, oh, that would never work for our community, but that might work for our community. And they can help take pieces that other people are using, so they're not always reinventing the wheel. So part of, in my opinion, the council's role is to really share information and resources so that we can all have great tools available to us for our programs. And then we are going to wrap it up talking about final stabilization and how does that play for construction oversight inspections. So I think I start with a quiz, and this is just a reminder again of what is, and let me just make sure the polls was something I forgot to double check. Interesting. Okay, I did, it's so funny, the irony, right? I checked this last time and it worked just fine, and now this one is not correct. So, okay. So we can use the chat box on this. Who can tell me what the scope, what are some of the scopes, the requirements or the scope of the construction inspection oversight for the MS4 inspector? What is, and I just kind of mentioned a few things just a few minutes ago. So what are some other things? Yeah, well, acre or more if to get the permit. But yeah, one of the pieces is that you have to evaluate all the pollutant sources, right? Including trash. And then, yeah, and then you have to evaluate the BMPs or the control measures. Are they adequate? Was there a failure to implement them? Do any of them need routine inspections? I mean, routine and maintenance. And then, yep, and proper installation, absolutely. And then, yeah, that last element is there or are there any discharges that are offsite of pollutants, right? Because you're allowed to have offsite discharges of stormwater. That's what your permits are allowing you to do. But what you're not allowed to do is have discharges with pollutants in them. And so if you do have that happen, you have to identify as the oversight inspector, if you observe that, where those discharges are occurring, and then evaluate, what the next steps are in terms of, is it going to go to enforcement right away if there's an actual discharge, or is it going to go through a normal routine inspection and you have them fix it? And it really depends what the discharge is. Sometimes we can have discharges of offsite sediment that are from tracking, right? And that's actually not so uncommon. However, if it gets into an inlet, then that's going to be a more severe consequence, and maybe a more severe consequence for the permittee in terms of the finding or the result from the inspection. And there was, I think I mentioned that someone, I think we got, so I know, sorry, I'm just looking through the attendance list. Yeah, so if you're on the phone and you haven't put your name in, make sure you put your name in the chat box so we can get you in for the attendance. Okay, so now that we know and we've covered thoroughly in part one what the scope is, and we've covered all the elements of that scope, we're going to talk about what's the frequency of our MS4 inspections. So on here, this is the phase 2 inspection frequency. I went into the non-standard permit, and it really does mimic phase 2 language. And I believe, and I have not checked all the phase 1 permits, but I believe that they also have a similar frequency. So this frequency requires that you have a routine inspection at least once to start. And actually, this is changed a little bit in the non-standard permit. It says you have to start off with at least a routine inspection, and that would be the more thorough inspection where the scope is what we've covered. You're looking at everything. And you have to have one of those at least every 45 days. and at least once before final stabilization occurs, which means if you have a very quick project like in the road that's going to be stabilized very quickly, you need to make sure you get out there and get one routine in. I'm going to talk about that initial inspection that we're now seeing in the non-standard permit, because my guess is we'll be seeing that when we get to the phase 2 renewal. I am absolutely not opposed to it. I'm a big believer actually in initial inspections. I think it's a great opportunity for communication and to introduce yourself to the permittee and to discuss what the expectations are. So for me anyway, I think it's very important to have initials. And I do think most municipalities do require that. Some even require it before you actually get your permit issued. Either case, I think having some type of initial is important out there. Again, just to communicate, to meet each other, to make sure you've established what the expectations are. So in addition to routine inspections, you can also have reduced site inspections. This is really going to occur once you've started your stabilization practices at the site, but you haven't necessarily reached final stabilization. In other words, once you've seeded and mulched, if you have seeding and mulch as part of your construction project, then you can drop down to an inspection once every 90 days. I do want to emphasize that these are minimum requirements. Your MS4 program could have more frequent requirements, but these are the minimum. So you absolutely, your program needs to be doing this. So you could drop to inspecting a site once every 90 days once they've they've seeded things and they've finished construction. And that's very important that they've finished construction. So it doesn't work very well if they're coming back, but you can also reduce down if there's going to be a delay in the project and they've stabilized everything, and then there's a delay and they'll be coming back in a few months. I have had that happen on a few of my projects. Just make sure, again, you document that. I would try to not only check off that you're using a reduced site inspection, but include notes or comments somewhere, whether it's in your software system or on your inspection reports, about why you've moved to reduced inspections. And then especially if you're going to go back to routine, what prompted that. The other type of inspection we have is an indicator inspection. This can be done every 14 days, and it's considered to be a much quicker inspection and not as thorough as a routine. And the idea here is it could even be a drive-by, which to me, I think that's a little challenging personally, but that's what it says currently in the permit. But the idea here is that it's a quick inspection and maybe you didn't evaluate all the potential pollutant sources. And that has to happen every 14 days to use it though. And then as soon as and I think I have a slide that gets into this a little bit more detail, if you have a finding, which most of us typically do at most active construction sites, then you're required to go back to a routine inspection on your next inspection. And that's really important that everybody understands, because if you have all these indicator inspections and you're counting them as indicators, and you have findings and you don't go back and say you're having a compliance follow-up or routine inspection with the full scope of the whole project, you will not be in compliance with your permit. So I want to make sure everybody understands that. A lot of municipalities do not use indicator inspections for this reason. But if you are using them, that's fine. Just make sure you're very clear about what the requirements are. And you also must start off, as I mentioned, with that routine to begin with. You can't just go to an indicator right away. So this is that new requirement that we're seeing in the, well, not new, it's the requirement that we're seeing in the non-standard permit that I fully expect to see in the phase 2 permit renewal and also in renewals with phase 1s. And that is to have an initial inspection before construction begins. The thing that is new to me, and again, at most municipalities I work with, they already require this. So if you're a municipality that doesn't require this, I recommend just starting to put this into your program because it's going to happen. And it's easier to start getting used to it gradually. And then if you forget to do it, you're not in violation of the permit. Whereas when this becomes into the phase 2 permits, if you don't do it, you will be in violation and out of compliance with the permit. The one thing that's very different for some municipalities is not everyone is going out there and taking the approved plan and making sure it matches. And so this is that new language that's coming up, saying you really have to emphasize more on the site plan. Now, for me personally, again, I like the idea of the very beginning, taking out that site plan and making sure the initial does match, unless they're phasing, right, their control measures. And I think this is where regulators don't understand that phasing piece. So we need to make sure that we let them know that it wouldn't be including all control measures sometimes, right? If control measures are phased, like let's say check dams in a swale you haven't even created, you're not putting the check dams in yet. Or if you have a linear project and you're only starting with phase one, or even a, even a home building project, if you're only starting in one area, this really needs to be some language in here that says, evaluate whether the approved site plan accurately reflects site conditions, including all maybe existing control measures and potential pollution sources, and phasing, right? Something about phasing, because we really want to avoid this idea of thinking that all control measures get installed day one. We don't even want to advocate that, because if there is not that pollutant source, they shouldn't be installed day one. But anyway, I think the main point is here that you're going to have to take those maps and you're going to have to check. What you have to also do is evaluate any changes and decide if the MS4 inspector will approve or deny them as minor modifications. And if they do, how do they document that? Or if they're going to require the owner or operator to resubmit the plans because there are major changes. And again, this really gets into this minor major modification process. And for those phase ones and phase twos that don't have a clear process for this, I highly recommend you work on it, because I'm quite sure this is going to come up in the phase two renewal. And I'm not sure that it will be removed due to stakeholder comments. That's my personal opinion. And I think with major site changes, you do need to have a process. And typically that process is it needs to go back through whatever the office kind of engineering review that's done. Whereas minor changes, I think, can be done in the field, but you have to come up with how are you documenting them. And for most of us, we're not necessarily always formally documenting those changes. So if we have a permittee that comes in that says, hey, I want to change from silt fence to sediment control log, in the past, I think we said, oh, okay, that works. Now we need to make sure we document it. And I think for many people, that's going to be in the notes section of their MS4 inspection report. But for others, it may be a variance process that they have. Yeah, and I really agree that, and so I just also ran into another municipality that's doing a pre-construction meeting. So you're going to have to decide, is it a pre-construction meeting without initial control measures installed, and then there's a follow-up to actually see the control measures in the field? Or are you going to have a pre-construction / initial where the control measures have to be installed? And there's pros and cons to both approach. I know the city of Aurora, they were doing what they call an echo, where they go over the control measures first before they're installed, just to make sure that they actually should all be installed. To me, that kind of gets into the site reviewer should have kind of checked that in the site review thing, but that's also is an opportunity for someone to say, could I install sediment control log instead of silt fence? So there might be some value to having that kind of meeting before control measures are installed. But this requirement from the MS4 permit is saying you really are going to have to go out there once the control measures are installed. So you're just going to have to evaluate whether your municipality has the bandwidth to have both kinds of meetings, and just know that the kind that checks the initial control measures before construction is what's required, or probably going to be required for phase twos, is required for non-standards now. So work on your program.
Jen?
Yeah.
Hey, Jen, so what we do in Parker is we review all those, and then we give them the required things that need to be changed on those plans that we need to see. Then we have that pre-con meeting, that this is just a flow of events. So they can install those BMPs, and And you can actually do that inspection at the time of the pre-con meeting, or we can go over it on site and then they can do it afterwards. But I've found that if you actually sit down and review those plans and go through them prior to anything happening, typically you find those things that need to get done differently. And then it flows smoother going through the pre-con and the install.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robert, because I do think that's why Aurora went to these echoes, is that they were finding that they got on site and things had been approved with control measures that were upgrading of areas that didn't need to be installed, or just needed, again, maybe it was silt fence because that's what the designer put on, but the contractor really wants to use something else. And that something else is actually maybe even a better fit, for the site. So I think that I think that there's a lot of merit to it. And I like that Parker is giving the option. So for like Aurora, it's not optional. You have to do the echo then, unless you're a utility company that does a ton of work with them and it's something that they know about. But typically you have to do that sort of pre-con and then also an initial inspection on site. So just make sure with your municipality, make it manageable, that you have the resources to do. But I do think there is some value if you do have the bandwidth of doing just like what you're talking about, Robert, of maybe asking the permittee, hey, do you want to go through these first? And Aurora is doing that virtually. So it does make it a pretty fast process. And it does give the contractor an opportunity to have gone out there with the site plans and make some suggested changes. So good points. But everyone will need to do initial inspections. And I recommend when you save your inspection report that you go ahead and call it in the file path name, and or also have a checkbox on your reports that are for initials specifically, so that when somebody reviews your reports, they easily can see, oh, here's the initial, here's routines. So make sure you set up your system so it's easy to know what type of inspection you're doing. Okay, back to the indicator inspections. Again, I think use these with caution. And I don't think it's terrible to use them, but I will say I do find that people get very confused about indicator inspections. Typically, what we use them for is when we do compliance follow-up, we're kind of just focusing only on the action items that were identified in the routine inspection. And so that would be kind of considered an indicator. You wouldn't be out there re-evaluating all of the pollutant sources. I think what's hard with indicators is the moment you have a finding, again, you have to go back to a routine inspection, and that's this fourth bullet here. So if the indicator inspection indicates a need for a compliance inspection, then another routine inspection must be conducted before the indicator inspection frequency and scope can be used again. And to me, and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but I feel like that means you do your compliance inspection and then you do a routine afterwards. So you have it called, hopefully you have something on your inspection form that indicates if you are using different types of inspections, indicates the difference between an initial, a routine, a reduced, and maybe even the final. And so you'll want to make sure that, again, if you're using indicator, that you then, and if you're just going out every 2 weeks, but you're actually doing routine, that's fine. It's this indicator that's possibly you're not evaluating all of the site. Any comments on this from anybody that uses routines? I'm sorry, indicators.
So Jen, this is Glenda.
Mm-hmm.
When we track this, we have the different types. We have initial compliance, routine, post-storm, if I go out and check on a site after a storm. And then we have the reduced, broke down into different categories, final stabilization, inactive site, winter conditions, So I can indicate that on each. And we do all ours. We use Cartograph OMS, and we had them build a module specifically for construction. So all of my permit details are in there. Every inspection and finding is in there. And I
Yeah,
generate reports.
that's a great way to do it, Glenda, because there are different reasons for having routine. I actually have, reduced inspections, and I have a slide, I believe, after this one about that. And it's great for someone to understand, well, why is it on reduced? Is it just for that they're waiting for the grass to grow? Or is it is it because of a different reason, such as it's inactive and it's gone inactive for the winter? We especially, people that are working in the foothills, if they're under their municipalities program, and sometimes we have that for counties, especially like Larimer County, Jefferson County, Boulder County, probably Douglas County, where there are sites that are more in their less urbanized area, but they've implemented their construction program countywide. And in the wintertime, they may not work on that project. They may, stop work in November and not come back again until the spring. And so that could be a winter exclusion, but it also can be reduced if they've, or both, depending on the situation.
And I just saw the comment. I also have a category for complaint if I'm out there for a citizen complaint.
I think that's a great idea too, because that's a big thing for regulators. They have to respond, not only us as representing MS4s, but also the state and EPA. They have to be responsive to public complaints. And so it's really important with a public complaint that you can mark that differently, so that if it comes up, you can look back through, you can document what the complaint was, document what your observations were, and whatever corrective actions might have needed to occur after your site visit. So I think that's a really a good one to point out. And as I mentioned before we move off the indicator inspections, they don't necessarily fully assess the adequacy of all the control measures and pollutants and site management. And that's why they're kind of considered a snapshot and a very quick inspection. And that's why you got to be careful using them. You can use them if you need to, but I really think, based on my experience, I almost always find at least one corrective action item at an active construction site. So it's going to push you right into a routine inspection again. So my advice is just be very, very careful if you're using these, because it's very easy to be out of compliance with the permit if you're not careful. So this is the other reduced inspection frequency that can happen. And as Glenda mentioned, it's really good to have your form so you can mark off the different things. Like maybe you're waiting for vegetation, maybe construction, is completed, waiting for vegetation reestablishment, or it could be that the site's inactive. It also can be if the site is part of what they call the Stormwater Management System Administrator Program, CSEP. Those contractors actually can go to a reduced inspection frequency. Now, I'm going to say this, though, that's very important. You are not required as a municipality, though, to use a reduced inspection frequency. And in fact, for most of the municipalities that I've worked with, they do not do this. But the state, because these folks are part of a state-run program where the state does more oversight, they are saying they can go to a reduced inspection frequency. So that's just something to think about for your municipality. Again, you don't have to do it, but if for any reason you happen to miss an inspection on a 45-day frequency, and you're evaluating whether you're out of compliance with your permit, you might want to also make sure that that contractor is not part of this program, because if they are, then you really wouldn't be out of compliance. You just need to mark and indicate on your inspection report that they are part of the CSEP program.
So this is Glenda again. For the first time, I actually have 2 sites that are part of that program. And what I did was, they do their weekly inspections for their state permit. They send me a copy, or they linked me into the program that they use. So I get a weekly copy of their inspections. so I can monitor how their site's going. And then I still do a 90-day routine inspection on site, or if Canyon Small, I drive by the sites all the time. If I'm seeing something, then I will call and schedule and do a routine inspection.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. I will say I've had a couple contractors in this program, one of which was amazing. And I felt like after 2 inspections, I felt pretty good about the site and I would have felt comfortable dropping down. But that municipality had chosen not to make exceptions, so we never did. But that is something to think about, especially if you have a small program and you're able to make some of those decisions, is, perhaps think about moving them to routine. Reduced, which would be that 90-day frequency, especially if you're able to get their reports and you're feeling like it's a pretty good site. And then you always have that ability to take that away. I have had a couple contractors, there have been shifts in this program, and there are a couple years back where all of a sudden it wasn't as good as it should have been. But I think a lot of that is changing, and most of the contractors are fairly good that are in it. The other reason that you can go to reduced is a staff vacancy. So for those of you who have an advertised position or someone has left your group and you have not filled it yet, this is something you can use. However, I would use it also, again, with caution. Because when people aren't out there, what I find with contractors is they are fully aware and they often may not put as much emphasis into their stormwater compliance, and you may end up with a discharge to your MS4 system, which that is a whole nother ball of wax. And so even though you're not going out there, you have this ability not to go out as frequently. Once you get that discharge to your MS4 system, then you'll have to get it addressed. And so that involves a lot of paperwork typically, and probably some enforcement. And it might just be easier to try to hit those routine inspections if possible, but then prioritize maybe some of them you can't hit if you just don't have the staff that are available because of the vacancy. The one thing that's very confusing here about this is this temporary leave due to vacation. I had someone else that was on this training once, and she ran her own, she was a one-person program, which is really hard, but she just wanted to take a week off. It's okay to take a week off, and honestly, you can use staff vacancy, but if you're doing your inspections every 45 days, typically you can just schedule around that. So if you can't, you can use this, but I tend to think of this as being a staff vacancy, like the position isn't filled. But of course, the way it is written in the permit is if there is an illness, especially if you have someone who's ill for quite some time, a medical issue. But I don't typically think of it as being used for vacation, but if you feel like you need to use it, I guess you could use it for that. Again, just like Glenda said, though, make sure your form has some way to convey this information. And if it doesn't, think about maybe revising your form, or at least using your notes or some kind of comment section so that you can put in these comments. Again, it's part of this communication, and effective communication for once, you're gone, or once you have a regulator on the site, or even a year later when you're trying to dig back through the records to remember what happens, that you've got it all documented in a written form. So I'm wondering out there what your program's frequency is. Are you using monthly inspections? That's what I'm finding most common, is most municipalities, even though it's 45 days, they're using monthly just so they don't miss that mark. Or there are a few folks that are using 2-week frequency. I know one municipality I'm working with right now, they typically use a month frequency for their routine inspections, but for their CIP projects, they actually use every 2 weeks with a full-blown inspection. So I'm wondering what everybody else is using out there. 30 to 45 days, depending on site. So that's the other good thing, is that flexibility, right? If you have sites that are not in good shape, every 7 days, that is super. That's because you're a qualified local program. Although Oh, that's interesting, but you probably don't have to do that. So that's really frequent. That's great. 30 days. I think 30 days, based on my experience in this class, has been the most common, 25 to 30. So if you are a municipality or a school system that you're trying to develop your program, I would say there's a reason that people pick 30 days or more frequent versus the 45. And again, it's so easy to miss. Like, especially, I'm a consultant. I've had different municipalities that, you know, it's money, you know, to pay us to come out and inspect on behalf of the municipality or the MS4. And so they want to try to have us out there as, you know, as minimally as possible to meet the requirements and still be effective, of course. So we're out there every 45 days, and I'll tell you, it's so easy to miss that mark. Or if you get sick, like you have it scheduled on day 45, and then you're sick day 45, then you're in this weird boat. Because again, I don't really think that's where staff vacancy comes in, but I guess it could. You know, I guess that is where you could use it. But it's much better to leave yourself some wiggle room there. And I think that's why monthly tends to be the most popular choice between most municipalities. Yeah, and 90 days, of course, you know, if you're reduced, that makes sense to me. I will throw out there for all of you that I do appreciate, in a way, that this municipality has gone to every 14 days for their CIP projects. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, because that's where you are co-permittees, right? And that would be true for most non-standards too, because it's your own projects. You know, you have a lot more liability there than a municipality that's regulating a private entity. So when you are also the co-permittee on the state, you know, SCP, stormwater construction permit, then you may want to think about having a greater frequency and presence, and also doing more of a paperwork check just to be sure everything looks good. All right, so the other type of inspection that we do are compliance inspections. That's going to be if we identify that there was a failure to implement a control measure, or there were inadequate control measures on site during the time of our inspection. And inadequacy, we went over that last week. What are some things that somebody can either unmute or put in the chat box for inadequate? What are some of the typical reasons we would mark inadequate control measure on our inspection report? Because there's a few different reasons that it might end up in that category. Yeah, so you might have a wattle when, and then indeed you have a big stockpile, and that stockpile is overwhelming that wattle or sediment control log, and you really need to have something more like a silt fence for that condition, maybe even a little further off from the toe, but that it's just not adequate for the height, or a steep slope behind it. A failing VTC beyond routine maintenance, absolutely. And remember, routine maintenance is it's still functioning as designed. So really anything that's not functioning as designed, but the control measure is in place, is going to be inadequate. Yeah, so bad concrete washout can absolutely be inadequate. No concrete washout should be failure to implement. And just remember, you really do want to know the difference between those in a way, although both of them require a compliance follow-up. So it depends how your form is set up, but it's good to know the difference. Yeah, 14-day stabilization, this is a big one. And that one might be failure to implement, but those are all good reasons to have to do a compliance follow-up inspection. So inadequate, failure to implement, or a discharge. If you have an actual discharge off-site, that's automatically a compliance follow-up. Now that compliance follow-up may also be accompanied by potentially a notice of violation, notice of non-compliance, warning notice, stop work, depending on how bad that discharge is. But those are all triggers for this compliance inspection. Now, what about if you and and somebody mentioned also the sanitary facility and the curb line that is secured. So I mentioned this at last week's meeting. We had somebody on from CDPHE, and for them, they feel like that sanitary facilities in the curb line is a violation. And even if it's secure, it should not be in the flow line. So they will be marking those in their finding report. So I think as MS4 inspectors, that's something we ought to be looking for out there too. I am actually trying to work with CDPHE to try to get them incorporated in this class. And I'm sorry, I ran out of time before teaching this class, but I did get some materials from them, and I'm going to see that if we can at a minimum have a recorded session that we're going to add to this class, and maybe even have them in person, but I'm not sure if that's going to be possible. But it'd be great to at least have them do a recorded session to kind of outline some of these things that they're looking for in the projects. And then ECB not installed correctly with the contours. I see that all the time. Also just not installed correctly, like they don't key in the top. And if you don't key in the top and put it all the way at the top, the water will just get underneath the blanket. So those are all inadequate controls measures, and they would prompt a compliance inspection. So would you need, true or false, do you need a compliance inspection follow-up if you identified routine maintenance during your MS4 inspection? Yeah, you do not. Now, I also do work with a lot of municipalities. They still want to see photos because sometimes, let's face it, things don't always get done unless you ask for a photo. So you can require photos. But you are not, per the permit, required to do a compliance inspection based on routine maintenance. And that's why it's super important when you go out there that you know the difference between routine maintenance and inadequate BMP or control measure. So the frequency on these compliance inspections, at least 14 days. So you have to be back within 14 days of that inspection that identified the issue or the non-compliance. So that's really important. Most municipalities, again, that I know, they ask for these to be fixed much quicker than that, but then it leaves them a little wiggle room to kind of go back and forth about, especially like seeding or VTCs where they're waiting for rock, you know, what kind of temporary controls can they do that would be considered passing before they get the bigger fix in. So that's really important. Also, we have a lot of contractors, unfortunately, that sometimes you have to keep reaching out to about what is it, you know, where are their photos or what did they do? Or if you're going back on site in person, you know, you go back a couple of days later, and if you weren't explicit that it had to be fixed within that couple of days, you know, then you might be going back more frequently. So make sure you have a clear program about what the expectation is on the timing of fixing and what the next steps are if you don't get that fix in place from the contractor, and what then enforcement might look like. And again, this is something I try to talk about at that initial inspection or pre-construction meeting too, so that they understand there is an enforcement program and there are consequences if they can't stay in compliance. You know, we also want to give sticks for when they can, I mean, carrots when they can, but I think we have to also emphasize that there are sticks. I have a whole slide on this, and I can't remember if it's in this section or if it's in the enforcement section, but the non-standard permit has a requirement for additional compliance inspections if after 3 routine inspections, if each one of those had findings. I think this is something that for phase 2 communities we need to be aware of. The issue I have with this, again, at an active construction site, I almost never have a passing inspection. I almost always have a finding, whether somebody drove over the silt fence and it's down, or the way that CDPHE has also required inadequate to be used. If you have a series of check dams and one of them is broken or needs maintenance, that's considered inadequate, even though you have a treatment train and you think that the treatment train overall is gonna minimize the potential for a discharge, you still have to call it out as inadequate. And what's hard about that is if you have 3 of these apparently in a row with your inspections under the non-standard permit, you actually have to move to a 14-day frequency on your inspections. Let me see if I have, I feel like it's here that somewhere that I have this, but not here. But we'll go back to that. I have a whole slide on it, but I'd love to get, maybe some thoughts for other people, but also just make sure you're all aware of that, because that would change for those of you who are doing 30-day inspections. That would make a lot of your sites probably become 14-day inspections. Although it sounds like not for very long, and we'll get into the details of when you can switch back to your normal routine schedule. But before we do, let's talk about operator compliance inspections. So you can either do your compliance forms in person, your compliance follow-up inspections in person, or you can ask the contractor or the operator to send photos to you. And some people use forms for this. And I'll tell you, it works really well if you're in a community that has a lot of contractors who hire third-party vendors who are experienced and have software and Adobe and are able to take photos with iPads or Surface Pro or tablets into this type of form, or at least have the ability to put the pictures in manually into the form. Where it doesn't work very well is when you're dealing with custom home builders or other contractors that they just aren't, computer things are just not their thing. And so they're more likely to send you just photos. And that's fine, but you have to have a way to document it in your system. And that report has to be the photos, and it also has to have the contractor's name and a date of when things were fixed. So just be aware of this, and you may need to have multiple options in your municipality. I'm working with a couple where we use the form, but we have a lot of contractors that can't use the form and they send us photos. I typically end up putting the photos in the form because I find that's easier. I have someone else that works for that same municipality and they just PDF the photos and put a date and their name on the first one, and that's what they call good. So just make sure you know in your organization that you're working with, what's their standard. I think if you're relatively small and you have enough time, it's better to put the photos into the form. But I completely understand if you don't have enough time, you're small and you're overwhelmed. So maybe you're just doing photos and putting, making sure you put the name of the project, the permit number, the contractor's name and the date, and then have the photos just as at least as PDFs or some kind of a way that it can be uploaded to whatever your system is that you're tracking your permits on. Any questions about that or any comments from anyone about the forms? I know I work with one municipality and they don't allow the forms at all, and that's okay, but or photos, they go back out to every site, which is great if you have the bandwidth. I just think if you're really struggling with bandwidth, this might be an area where you just ask for photos. And for me, I'm pretty good with that, but it does take time to look through the photos and make sure that they actually send you all of the correct photos and the follow-up. So I think there's some pros and cons. The other thing I'll mention is you could decide for your community to allow this kind of photo documentation for the sites that you feel have been in compliance most of the time, and then not allow it for sites that are not in compliance and you're always having to track down the photos, or when you get the photos, it doesn't include them all. So just know that you don't have to have a one size fits all for all of your sites. You can have different parts of your program. Just make sure that you're written this into your construction program so it's clear what the options are and who makes sort of the decision on which option to go with. Okay, here's that slide I promised you for the non-standard permit. If there are 3 consecutive routine inspections that require compliance inspections, that means there were either inadequate control measures, failure to implement, or a discharge. If you have 3 of those in a row, then you have to go to a 14-day inspection frequency. The interesting part about this, and the part that doesn't bother me as much or makes this seem more palatable, is it says that you only have to do that 14-day frequency when the site, you can stop doing the 14-day frequency when the site no longer has an illicit discharge, which maybe it never had to begin with, right? I mean, you don't want to have an illicit discharge. Of course, you wouldn't let that keep happening. Or that the failure to implement the control measure is resulting in an increase of discharge for pollutants. And this is different, right? This is an actual increase in discharge. It doesn't say potential. And then also the third caveat, as long as the site is no longer having inadequate control measures resulting in an increased discharge of pollutant. So again, this doesn't, to me, I mean, this is where I think we'd want clarification in a way, although I don't know, maybe you don't want clarification. To me, this says that unless the site is actually discharging and having an increased discharge of pollutant, that you can get out of that 14-day frequency pretty quickly. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of the compliance follow-up items that we're looking at often aren't an actual discharge, nor are they causing an increased discharge of pollutant. They're just a potential. So I don't know what anybody else's thought is on this. I'm kind of curious.
Hey, Jan, so in Parker, that's really how that works for us, is if you have a fail to implement or inadequate. I mean, our plan is we come back 3 to 7 days, unless it's something really severe, and then we might come back the next day. But kind of how this works for us is once I come back out and I do a complete inspection and you pass everything, boom, you go back to the 30 days. So it's kind of just the way it works, automatic, not, we don't continue to go 14 days from then on out. It gets bumped back after everything's a clean bill of slate.
So I think that's the way it is for most municipalities. I feel like this is saying, and again, this is where it's always a little confusing in the permit language. I feel like what this is saying is you do have to come back in 14 days. So you do your compliance follow-up, which you're talking about, right, to make sure everything gets fixed that was an issue. Then I think you're going to have to come back the way this is written, and my interpretation of it, you'll have to come back within 14 days. And then if it doesn't have an illicit discharge or failure to implement a control measure that results in an increased discharge or inadequate control that results in an increase, then you can switch it back to your 30-day. But I think yeah.
So basically, you're thinking that they want a second full inspection, because you would come back anyway if it failed your re-inspection. So what you're saying is if you pass the re-inspection, they want you to come back 14 days to check it again to make sure everything passes before you go back to the 30 days.
Yeah, although I will say to you, what's super confusing to me on this is it says if there are 3 consecutive routine inspections that require compliance inspection, but then it says the 3rd inspection must be conducted. So then it's almost like after the 2nd, right? Then it's the 3rd one you're conducting as a routine. But I agree with you. I just think this is really vague. I don't think it's worded well. And I think we would have to understand, because I think this assumption, and this is where I think we're going to need, and this non-standards probably need this from CDPHE. To me, this sounds like they think that with the previous 2 routine inspections that it's the same item, and it wouldn't be the same item, right? We're escalating as soon as something really doesn't get fixed that's identified the first time in a routine. Although, then it's going to a compliance inspection and then it's escalating from there. So it's not going to ever go back to a routine with a site that didn't fix something to begin with. So I can't decide if that's what they're trying to get at here. But if you do the 3rd compliance inspection, my thought is you would be finding different items each time. And that's why you have compliance follow-ups, not that it's the same item. And then the 3rd one being conducted as a routine with the routines, which of course but then it says compliance inspection. So And that's fine if you do the third compliance inspection as a thorough versus just looking, because I do think some municipalities are only looking at the corrective action item. So let's just say we had a site that had a vehicle tracking control pad that, you know, wasn't being operated correctly. But the first two sets of routines were different items. The third one identifies this vehicle tracking control pad with maintenance, a more than maintenance issue that's inadequate in its current condition. To me, it's saying when you come back for that third inspection, you can't just look at the VTC. You have to do a routine inspection looking at everything in the site. And then what I don't understand is it doesn't say to me if that routine inspection is okay, you can just go back to routines. And I think that's where we need clarification, because to me it says then you have to do another routine because you're probably going to find something, right? I mean, unless you make it clear to the contractor, maybe you'll come back, but my guess is you're going to find some other item that's new, right? Maybe, hopefully not. Maybe you come back in a day or two, make sure it's not.
Pretty tough not to find something in most cases.
Active construction, for me, a big flag goes up when you don't find stuff, to be honest with you. You know, unless it's not an active site, then of course.
So I don't know how other municipalities do it, but here, if I come back, if I have to come back 3 times on the same thing, they will be in a stop work at that point.
I think you're gonna,
you know,
yeah.
I don't even mess with fines or anything like that. For me, it's way easier. I'll stop your work because one day of stopped work is going to cost you thousands of dollars in most cases. And so when they get to the notice of intent to stop work, it's amazing how quick stuff gets done, you know? So that's kind of how I deal with it. Sure, we have the ability to assess some fines or whatever, but I don't even mess with that. That's too much paperwork. It's just easier to put them right to, you know, you make the decision on how much it costs you. Because if I issue a stop work, I will not, and I tell them up front in the pre-con meeting, I will not come back until the next day. It'll be 24 hours. You won't be working.
No, I think that's great. I mean, that is super effective. I know there are some communities out there that unfortunately politically aren't able to do that, but they certainly are still escalating enforcement, whether that enforcement be a fine or whether it be, you know, however their enforcement program looks. But I agree with you that all of us would be enforcing if it were the same item. Like we wouldn't even get to a third routine inspection. We'd be in enforcement inspections, right? So this is one with the phase 2 renewal. I think we all need to be watching because I think the language is really ambiguous and difficult to understand. And the way I unfortunately interpret this is that no matter what you identified, even if it's not the same item, if you get to your third item, your third routine in a row that has a finding, and I will tell you again, that's most all of the sites that I inspect that are active, with a few exceptions. They're going to be in this caught in this net where, you know, the third after the third routine, my follow-up has to be very thorough, not just the item that was out of compliance. And then it has to go to 14. But then I think it gets out of 14 really quickly because the way they've written the requirements for getting out of the 14 and going back to routine, because most of us aren't having an actual discharge. For most of us, it's just the potential, right? Or an inadequate that it's not installed per detail, or that it's inadequate for other reasons, but it's not necessarily causing an increased discharge of pollutants. So I think this is just where I encourage everyone here who's phase 2, make sure people are reading this when this comes out in draft language, because I think it's problematic the way it's written. But for non-standards who are on the phone, unfortunately, this is in your permit already. So I would recommend, you know, and this might be something the council wants to take on, potentially the permit compliance group. You what is this saying? Because I've been doing this a long time, and to be honest with you, I don't think it's super clear.
Jen, this
To
is Joe.
me, yeah, it's poorly written.
So the permit compliance committee has already started talking about last week of forming a subcommittee to start going over the new non-standard permit language, or reviving those comments along with the Denver non-standard and Colorado Spring, or Denver's phase 1 permit, the Colorado Springs phase 1 permit, and start to pre-evaluate and develop comments for this language, because CDPHE has already indicated that the language that are in these newly issued permits are going to either directly be in the phase 2 permit or are going to strongly drive that language. And there's lots of things, especially in the non-standard and Denver's, that are concerning.
Well, I think that's great news, Joe, because I do think, a lot of people who are in this training today have been doing this a long time. And I think when you read this, it's not super clear what it's saying. And I think, yeah.
This is ambiguous in how it reads. It would get you stuck in a 2-week cycle in perpetuity. Because as we know, it's not just passing with maintenance, it would be a full passing inspection. And I firmly believe if you're doing your job, you're gonna find something. There's very, very few sites that I think you go in and find absolutely nothing, unless they're really sites that are probably getting to the point where they should be moved to a reduced inspection frequency. There's just no way, especially with vertical construction, there's no way you can keep everything in great working order and pass. So, but this language would hold you on the hook, possibly ongoing, to the point where you should just move your program to 2-week inspections.
And the resources for 2 weeks, it's not out there for every organization, right?
No,
so,
I mean, when I was with El Paso County, we had 5 inspectors, and we were basically on 2-week inspection cycles. Almost all the sites, we had very few that we'd put to 45-day or 90-day, and it was 5 people full time because of that 2-week. We had 2-week requirements. So
yeah, this is Glenda. I started out doing the 14-day reduced with a 90-day full inspection. It was more than I could handle. So I had to go, I changed my program so they're 45-day, unless they're, way out of compliance, then it triggered compliance schedules. But I couldn't keep up with, because I run the entire permit program, not just construction inspections, and I could not keep up with even doing 14-day drive-bys.
Yeah, I hear what everyone's saying, because I agree with that. And I feel like I'm not really sure that was the intent of this language, to be honest with you. I think the intent is, and again, I'm just speculating, but I think the intent is this idea that if you have the same item that's showing up for 3 inspections in a row, but that's not what the language says. And as Robert pointed out, all of us would expect we wouldn't keep doing routine inspections if the item didn't get fixed, right? It goes into escalation immediately, starting once you identify it, then you do your compliance. And if the compliance inspection isn't satisfactory, you go right into escalation and enforcement. You don't keep doing routine inspections. So I just think it probably needs to be, the language needs to be crafted different if the intent that they have is to get municipalities to make sure that they aren't just passing through things that are, never got fixed. I don't think that's happening under the current language, but if they felt the need of something to change, we need to understand what it is they're trying to change. But do know this is out there. And the reason I think this is because of the stop work language that they start talking about. So to me, I think they're trying to say as enforcement occurs, you're going out there every 14 days, which most of us are going out way more frequently than that if we're in enforcement. Okay, actually, let's take a break. I always like to, in the morning, take a break. So let's come back at 9:15. And then we'll pick back up again with what needs to be on your inspection reports. And we'll kind of talk about some of what Glenda had too, because this is the minimum. But I think it's a really good idea to mark what type frequency you're doing and to really get into the details of those frequencies. All right, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're back from our break. And we're going to talk about the documentation of all these inspections that we just went over. So for your documentation, you need to have at a minimum, and you can have a lot of other things, but you need to have the inspection date, the name of the inspector, the site identification, whether you're using a permit number or whether you have project name or both, your inspection results. So that means you really need to indicate, and for a lot of municipalities I've been working with, we have a checkbox and we indicate whether we have an illicit discharge, failure to implement, inadequate, and then also we do have one for routine maintenance. So you need to make sure you do have a way to indicate those results on your form or in your software. And again, if it's routine maintenance, that does not trigger a compliance inspection. But if you do identify the illicit discharge, failure to implement, or inadequate, then you have to do a compliance inspection. So you want to be, sort of indicating that, the result is a deficient result or a result requiring a follow-up, something to that effect. And then also you want to make sure that and I don't really always understand this one, if the inspection is conducted in lieu of a compliance inspection, the identification of any inadequate control measures that were not resolved previously. To me, typically I try not to mix my inspections together. I have occasionally with the municipality that's doing it every 2 weeks, I've had to do a compliance follow-up because they didn't send me, like they were missing one of the photos. And I was chasing after it and didn't get it before I was back again in 14 days. So I'm marking off a compliance follow-up as well as a routine on the type of inspection. But then always in the notes, I'm putting down that the items that were missing from the previous inspection with the date were, observed and in place. And then the type of inspection, again, whether it's a routine, whether it's indicator, reduced. And then I like what Glenda said, as well as providing, maybe a little more detail, especially for reduced, because there are many different reasons of why it could be reduced. And then also, I think someone else said, or if it's a citizen complaint, really good to be able to indicate that type of inspection. So this is just an example. I think I happen to have Castle Pines on here. So in this one, we mark down the project name, the address. We actually do list the SCP permit number, which is that number from the state. It's under the Colorado Discharge Permit System. We put in that number because we just want to make sure that they had that permit. You could also just have this as a checkbox as something you review as part of your review. You also aren't required to have it. So this is not a required item. It's more of just if your municipality or organization believes that they want to check if there is coverage for permits that are required to have coverage under that system, that they have it. But again, that's kind of an optional thing. We have the date of inspection. We have the project contractor information. In the city of Castle Pines, as well as Douglas County, and I believe Parker, we have guest managers. So that's written in there, who that person is and their contact information. And then you want to put in some kind of that frequency, and you can call it frequency also. And as Glenda was talking about for routine, we have here the routine, but then for the reduced, we have these, and then we have circle which one that it's supposed to be for, whether it's an inactive site, part of the stormwater management program, or the staff vacancy. The inactive sites, the only thing I don't like about this one is that it can be both an inactive site that is just waiting for grass to grow, as well as an inactive site that maybe is on pause. Although I will say in Castle Pines, I'm not aware of any projects that are on pause. But we do definitely have those, like more in the foothills and other places where they stop for the winter and then resume again. Or occasionally I've had design conflicts that are, really big design conflicts where they go inactive for months. So that could apply to that type of site. So you may want to separate those out if that's helpful for your municipality. If that doesn't ever occur, perhaps you don't need that. And then you may or may not include photos into your inspection report. So that's something that your municipality will have to decide. There's a pro and a con, right, of including photos. I think the pro is that it shows people where you're talking about. And often on a big site, the contractor cannot really know, like if you just check silt fence, they don't really know where you're talking about. So it's much easier if they have a photo. The downside is, you're documenting non-compliance, but I feel like when you get the photo that's showing that it's fixed, then, you're also documenting that it's been fixed. I think the hard part here is if you are going to do a photo of non-compliance, you do need to make sure that you try to, even if you do an in-person inspection, you really should take a photo to document that it's been fixed. Just that's the downside of photos is I think if you have one showing it, the non-compliance, you always want to have one showing the fix. The other thing we're really emphasizing in this class, and it can't always happen in person, but if you can review your inspection reports with the permittee, that's a really great way to do it. And especially if you have time and they're available and you can walk it. I can tell you though, when you have a lot of project sites, it's a scheduling nightmare to try to meet every permittee. So you'll have to weigh that. If you're with a smaller community, maybe that you are able to walk it with the permittees. I do try with CIP projects to always walk them with the permittee, because I feel like there again, the organization is a co-permittee on that SCP permit. And so it's really important that they're hearing and seeing what I'm seeing. So hopefully we can prevent it even in the future from going unnoticed or unfixed before the MS4 inspector comes out. If you're not going to review it in person, that's fine, but you should be at least emailing them out to people. And I really recommend that you email out even inspections that are passing, so that folks know that you've been out on the site and they know that you've been looking at it. I did work with a municipality where they only sent out inspection reports for items where there were deficiencies. And I just think it's kind of sends the wrong message, in my opinion, but I understand why they do it. But if you're going to do the inspection, you might as well send all of them out. Again, it really gets into that communication. The other thing is, if you start to have a site that you're starting to have compliance issues with repeatedly, you want to make sure that if you are not the MS4 coordinator for your organization, that you get with that MS4 coordinator and just give them a heads up. Hey, this could be fine, but we have a potential here where we're going to have to move to enforcement, maybe a stop work order. It's much better to have those conversations early in the game than to all of a sudden at the 11th hour when you want to issue a stop work order to have that conversation. Again, if you're the MS4 stormwater coordinator, then you know who you need to be talking to, but this would really be for inspectors that are not holding that position. You just want to make sure, again, you're communicating within your organization too about some of these sites. This is just a blow up of what we already talked about, making sure that you do mark the frequencies. As someone mentioned, complaint, we have that marked off here too, because that's really important to identify. And we actually have the other category too. There are times that you might want to use the other. For example, if you are aware of maybe an inspection happening at a nearby site by a regulatory agency, maybe you want to go out to that site that they're going to be inspecting, and maybe even some of the sites nearby. For whatever reason, you can always mark other and then put in here why you went out. This is also a blow up of just that having checkbox for failure to implement, inadequate. This one happens to have offsite tracking, but you don't have to have that per the permit. That was just added to this one because it was important for this group. And then were offsite discharges observed. That's required, right? That's that illicit discharge, they're calling it, even though it's more of an offsite discharge. And then routine maintenance. And then here, this is optional, and this could be guest manager or swamp administrator. You know, were the results discussed? And sometimes it's helpful to know that, because it's helpful to know, like, hey, did you meet with them on site and talk to them about this? And then if you continue to not have a response, then I think it shows that, you know, you had these verbal communications that occurred. And then I highly recommend for everyone, if you don't have this on your form, is to put in, were all the pollutant sources evaluated? Because remember, that's a requirement of the permit. But there might be times where the answer is no. When do you think, when, for those of you who have been doing this, oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know why our admin set that, not that Liz, who's doing an amazing job, but a different admin set up this meeting, and she put on weight room, which I really struggle with, because once we get going, it's hard for me to watch the weight room. But yeah, feel free to always text, that's or put it in the chat, which I am watching more carefully. So when do you think we would ever check off that we didn't evaluate all of the pollutant sources? Can anybody think of some times they might check that?
If you're doing a compliance and only looking at those items that were out of compliance at the last inspection.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're doing a compliance follow-up inspection and you are not doing a routine of the whole entire site, and you might be, maybe that's your program, but if your program only really requires you to look at the items that were outstanding or were in non-compliance during your last inspection, then you're going to check off no. And you might want to even put in a little description. No, you know, this was a follow-up item, follow-up inspection, only outstanding items were evaluated. The other one that someone mentioned absolutely is snow cover. You know, if it's covered in snow, you can't possibly be evaluating all the pollutant sources. So it's okay to check no. Sometimes we get a mindset that we have to always be checking yes for these type of questions. And there are times where the answer is no. It's snow covered, snow obstructed. Maybe, you know, there's some other kind of too muddy and you couldn't get in, right? Like to get into the site, you would have had to drag out a bunch of mud with you, and maybe it just wasn't very feasible to walk it. So whatever it is, make sure you just document it. This is the big take home from this class, is communication and documentation. So make sure you document it. The other thing is, if you happen to have a complaint and the complaint was really centered around some specific item, you might only go out and look at that specific item. So all good reasons for for not evaluating all of the pollutant sources. Oh, the other one is if you're doing an indicator inspection. So if you did check off that it's an indicator inspection up here, then you would also want to check off, no, not all pollutants were evaluated. And that's okay, because it doesn't require you to evaluate all of them if you're doing that type of inspection. So speaking of communication, we're going to dive into this for a couple of slides. As I mentioned, big take homes from this class are communication and documentation. And the communication is not just with the permittees, although most of these slides are going to be about that. It's also about communicating with your group and within your organization. And I think I mentioned that on the last slide we had is, you know, if you're starting to have a problem with the site, especially if you are an inspector that has an MS4 stormwater coordinator as your supervisor, you're going to want to make sure to give them the heads up. Or also if it's a CIP project, you're going to want to reach out to the CIP managers and say, you know, I'm really struggling with this project. You know, we don't seem to be understanding what compliance is. Is there a way that we can have a meeting together? either just internally first and then with the contractor, or how do you want to handle this? Because they play a really big role in those CIP projects. And again, you just don't want to wait till the last minute and say, you know what, I want to stop work on this project, and then have the CIP manager or even the MS4 coordinator say, well, boy, I had no idea you were even having problems with it. So you want to have those communications early in the process. Also, when you're working with the contractor, you want to be very careful about directing the contractor. And this is super easy for all of us to do. And we really want to be careful about, and we talked about this last week too, I think Bill was mentioning, and sometimes there are times you can direct the contractor, especially if the contractor really does not seem to understand stormwater compliance, but you want to be careful about it. Because really your role is to identify non-compliance to them, and they need to then respond and fix it. Your role is not necessarily to create a plan for their project that would meet, the expectations. However, we all understand sometimes we have to do a little more leading of the horse to the water to get the result that we need, and hopefully maybe encourage them to do some trainings, which some of them may or may not do. I'm always surprised. Some folks are actually really interested, and especially even if they have an inspector who is fairly green, sometimes those inspectors are actually pretty interested because they're looking to further their own professional development. So, make sure you kind of explore some of those opportunities. And we do have the CIP class, which again, doesn't have to be for CIP contractors. It can also be for other folks that are doing construction. So the language I try to use is I try to stick with the permit language, to be honest with you, about that my job is to make sure that the organization is meeting their requirements of their MS4 program. And I think that really helps when you put the context in of what your role is. And then also try to use the language in the permit, like that you are required to look for inadequate and to identify inadequate control measures, failure to implement, routine maintenance, and illicit discharge. Versus, you have to put silt fence here. You can say this area is inadequate in its current condition. I'm happy to talk to you about what some recommendations might be, if that's what you want, if that's helpful for you. But I think you need to say that to sort of preface it versus all of a sudden telling them you have to put silt fence here, and inlet. I mean, inlet protection is really tough because that's pretty straightforward, right? Like it's going to be failure to implement if you don't have inlet protection in. But you can say it that way, as anytime I see an inlet that's not protected, I have to mark it as failure to implement a control measure. So that's why you have to have that protection there. So as much as possible, try to do it as compliance assistant versus directing them. The other thing is sometimes it really, as I mentioned, really helps to put into context what your job is, and that your job is to be out there looking for these things and trying to make sure that the site's in compliance. And the reason why you're doing that is because your organization has a permit and those requirements to the state. And you can talk about water quality too, but I think it really hits home with a lot of contractors when they understand, hey, this is this person's job. That they're not doing this to be mean or to pick on me. This is their job to do this. Also, the other big thing I can tell newer folks especially is be clear and concise when you're asked a question. And if you don't know the answer, don't make one up. Don't sort of stretch and be like, I'm not sure, but I think this. I would say, could I get back to you on that? That's a really good question. I'd like to get back to you. I'd like to check on a few things and get back to you on it. Because the worst thing you can do is tell them the wrong thing and then have to call them or meet with them again and say, sorry, but what I told you was wrong. Because they also then start to think that you don't know what you're talking about. So I would really encourage you, if you're unsure of the answer, there's nothing wrong with saying, I need to check on a few things and get back to you. It's absolutely very professional. It does not make anyone think that you absolutely don't know the answer. It just makes someone think that, maybe you need to thoroughly check into some aspect of it to get back to someone. The other really big one is you want to make sure that you understand your organization's program. So for instance, you know, Robert was talking about if they come out there and they have a certain time period where then, you know, if it doesn't get fixed, it's going to be a stop work order. You want to make sure before you start throwing around the word stop work order that your organization is behind that and it is the program. Because if you get out there and say, hey, we're going to issue a stop work order on Friday if this isn't fixed, it's not fixed on Friday and you don't have any backing and you can't issue a stop work order, it's really going to make it seem like, you know, that you're out of sync with the program. And they're not going to believe you for the next time either, probably. So again, just make sure you know your organization's programs as well as their criteria. You know, like Parker has their own standard notes and details. Castle Pine has their own. Douglas County has their own. And there are a lot of similarities, but they are different. So you want to make sure in your municipality, and if you don't have, you know, specific details for your organization, that's okay. If you're using Mile High Flood District, no problem, but make sure you know what that detail says. If that detail says you have to trench in the silt fence 6 inches, you know, make sure you know that. I do love, and I think I mentioned this last week, Robert, somebody else from your organization, he had details printed out in paper copies. And when he saw like silt fence not being installed correctly or sediment control log, he would hand them the detail for Parker and say, you know, this isn't installed correctly. Here's our detail. You need to install it just like this. And I thought that was such a great thing. And I often email people like, I'll have to come back to the office though and be like, here's the detail for the proper installation of the VTC, or, you know, the proper installation for sediment control log. But it's nice to have that right at your fingertips.
Yeah, there's another thing you can do easily if everybody prints off a copy for their vehicle. And then when I do my reports, I've gone to, instead of giving out a paper copy, I take my iPad and take a picture of that actual detail and I email them that detail with their report. And so they can't come back to me and tell me they haven't seen it or don't have it or whatever. And then you were talking earlier, I'll touch on this, about keeping everybody in the loop, which is a tremendous idea. But when I reach the notice of intent to stop work inspection, a copy of that goes to the town director, the town administrator, and the town lawyer even, so they know what's coming up if something happens.
That is a great system. I don't know that everybody has a notice of intent process. So I think that's a really good idea, is maybe to put something in play like that so that everybody is notified. But yeah, those are all really good points. And I will mention, I mean, I think we talked about it actually last week, that the CDPHE, when they come out, they do that. They take a picture of that control measure and then a picture of the detail, and they put it right in their report and say this, they weren't installed per detail. So I think it's a great idea. As much as we as MS4 inspectors can do something similar, it's a great way to do it. And yeah, when they submit those plans, they should have all the details. I think it's always amazing to me though, what I find is that the crew sometimes that's installing these controls, they've never even seen the swamp. So sometimes it is helpful to make sure those installers are actually getting the details. And you can also tell the permittee that, you know, hey, things are not being installed per detail. They're all in your swamp. Can you make sure your crews that are installing the controls have, you know, a copy of those details? So, you know, this first bullet, you know, we all try to be pleasant. We all have our days where we're more pleasant probably than others. And it is hard because sometimes some contractors might push your buttons, and especially if you've had a lot of dealings with them. So I think you just have to really try to go in as much as possible and remember that this is your job and you are, you know, a professional here. You expect to be treated like a professional too by the contractor. And you can say that, like, you know, I feel like, you know, this conversation is heading into a direction where, you know, this is no longer a professional conversation. And I think we need to table it and we can come back when we can both speak to this, you know, in a professional manner. I think what you don't want to do is risk your job. And it gets risky when you start falling into being able to be manipulated by the contractor and to, react in a way maybe that you wouldn't normally react. And it's okay to get, a tiny bit bristly, but I think you have to be very careful not to go to some place that doesn't show your professional side. So just keep that in mind. And if you feel like you need to leave, you can always do that. Like if you're in the middle of a conversation and you can just see the conversation is not going to go anywhere, I highly recommend just trying to, table that part of the conversation. If you have other things to talk about those items. Leave, think about what happened, think about whether you need to bring someone else in. Again, if you have a stormwater supervisor, perhaps it's a time where they start to get involved and it's an on-site meeting to talk about the project overall, or perhaps it's at least stepping away from that certain discussion at that precise time and coming back to it later after you can think about what needs to be said to convey what's happening appropriately.
So Jennifer,
Mhm.
I will add to that. This is Glenda. I actually had that situation where it was the site owner who was acting as the construction manager, also constantly out of compliance with one of his BMPs. And I was there numerous times, gave him notices of non-compliance, was ready to move forward. Oh, actually did move forward with fines. And he accused me of being racist. And at that point, I wished him a good day. I left the site. I got my supervisor and the city administrator involved, documented it all. We resolved it finally, but yeah, I was like, what? I'm doing my job.
But that's a really good point, Glenda, because what you don't want to do is then sit there and argue with him about why you're not racist, right? Because it just, there are times in our conversations where we realize that this conversation is not going to get resolved and I need to step away. And I think you did a great job of realizing that. I had someone with a municipality and she was the MS4 stormwater coordinator. This site was in horrible shape and it repetitively had issues. She, said that, and the permittee accused her of making it a personal vendetta, and it had nothing to do with a personal vendetta. She was trying to do her job. And that's the thing, I remember the first project I had where we had to go to enforcement, I was like kind of nervous. And I was like, oh, I feel kind of, I'm feeling bad about this. But it isn't something to feel bad about. It's a process. And, we hope to not go there, but if that's where the process is leading you, that's what needs to happen. And there's no personal things about it. It's pretty straightforward in that if you can't be in compliance, this is the process. And so I think we all have to remember that we are out there doing our jobs, and that is the process that's required. And as much as we can be clear about the process by having these initial site meetings, letting them know about the enforcement program, I also do try to warn people, hey, we've had a lot of compliance issues. I just want to let you know, it looks like the site's going to be subject to, whatever the process is next, whether it's a warning notice, whether it's a notice of violation, whether you're in Parker and it's going to go to a stop work. I mean, to let them know ahead of time, hey, just want to let you know that my hands will be tied. If you can't get this fixed by Friday, it's going to go to a stop work. So it's a very clear process. And again, that you've communicated it and you've documented everything is what you need to do on your part. And then you do need to step away occasionally if people are trying to make it something that it's not. So I think you did a great job. This other woman, I felt horrible when this person, because of course he went to all the city council and said it was a personal vendetta, and it just got really nasty really quickly. And the reality is it wasn't anything personal. They couldn't keep their site in compliance, and they didn't want to have a stop work order. And so they, wanted to choose to believe somehow that they were being singled out, which was not the case. But yeah, so really good things. And again, another reason I just encourage all of you to think about the construction committee, because you will have sympathetic ears and people who have experienced a lot of these kind of things in that committee too. Because especially when you're new, you're like, oh my gosh, what a headache this is. But the more you think about it as your job, and the more you think about, first of all, hopefully not very many sites go through that process, but unfortunately you are going to have a couple of sites that are problematic. They're difficult to deal with. And, you know, as much as they're in non-compliance, they're going to try to fight and be difficult going into enforcement also. So again, clear communication and clear documentation. Okay, I think we kind of really hit that. The other thing is I really would encourage you to, as much as possible, communicate with your permittees, or at least get to know who the right person is to talk to. Because that is the hard part. If they've never seen you before, they've never met you, maybe even they have never gotten your reports before, and all of a sudden you're going to a stop work, it can be very confusing. So I think as much as you can be giving, you know, people, hey, here's my report, here it's deficient, here are the items. You know, if you're making it very clear and concise, then it's very clear that they have to respond versus, you know, I never got a report, and maybe, you know, you've been sending it to someone that's not involved in the project anymore, which totally happens because there's a lot of changeover. But I just encourage you as an inspector to make sure you stay on top of who your contacts are for a project. And if they change, getting that new information and updating your contact list.
Hey, Jen, one thing I would tell everybody, because if you're doing a lot of vertical building for housing, your on-site superintendents will change monthly, bi-monthly. I'm sure you're all aware of this. Make sure that you know who the area manager is and include him on all your reports. I find that when the area manager gets copied on stuff, and then he sees a second notice of something not being done, things get handled much more quickly. And you'll also find that that area manager, if you're not contacting the right person, he'll immediately send you the contact information for the right person. So just a little bit of help there.
Yeah, I would really echo that. When you're starting to go into enforcement, it may not be the distribution list that you've been sending your inspection reports out to. And that's where you're going to want to work with who the legal responsible entities are. And then also, especially if it's a larger home building firm, they're going to have regional area managers. And you're absolutely correct. Like those home building companies, they actually on a very high level take compliance very seriously, because a few of them have had some major issues. And so if they're not aware of these local things that are happening, they can't help and assist with getting them resolved. But as soon as they do get involved, they will typically get it back into compliance. Yeah, and I think also we had that happen with a legally responsible person where this site really was having problems, and it was that municipality required the owner as well as the contractor. And so when they started having NOVs, the owner was also contacted, and that owner said, oh my gosh, I had no idea that things were not happening out at the site or that there were problems. And so it created a whole different dialogue that was happening. That's that main permit contact.
One thing I found, I had to modify my actual written reports and put a big explanation paragraph in there of what the expectations, if they were routine maintenance or inadequate, that I was not stopping work on the site. I had an inexperienced owner who thought that every little thing meant that they had to stop work and immediately correct things before they could continue work. And so even though I verbally explained to her every time, no, you can continue work, but you do need to address these. I ended up putting it in my written inspection report that, you know, this was not a stop work order. You will be notified of if there is one,
Mhm.
you know, so yeah, kind of know your level too, get to know your owners and site managers so that you're clear on your expectations.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point of, if you are having problems at a site, I mean, I often pick up the phone and try to reach out to somebody too. And I think, especially if you have a foreman that you're mostly dealing with, I think sometimes you are going to have to go, above them. But make sure again that you're dealing with the right person and that you're clear and concise with them too. Again, I would just stick with what the facts are and what the non-compliance issues are, and make sure they understand the process. So I'm going to warn you guys, turn down your volume a little bit. I don't know why, but this recording is super loud. But this is Steve Matakowski from Mile High Flood District. And this clip is really short. We had two clips, one we used for the CIP training, but this one a little bit gets into communication, and just make sure you're communicating, because people like Mile High, they could come into your municipality and be working. And again, they just want that communication. And some of them really want to walk the site with you. And I know it's not always easy and you don't have a lot of time, but I do recommend for permittees that want to walk the site with you, if you're easily able to coordinate with them, give them that opportunity to walk the site with you, especially the first couple times, because it can be really helpful for them also to understand what you're looking for out there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start it, and I'll let you turn down your... Welcome. I'm here with Steve Matakowski with Urban Drainage at Sanderson Gulch Project to talk about stormwater compliance during construction. Welcome, Steve.
Hey, Jen.
And this class that we're giving through the Colorado Stormwater Council is really geared towards our MS4 inspectors. And I'm wondering what advice you might give them when they're inspecting an urban drainage project, and what things to kind of make sure are in place, and maybe some of the communication that they might want to have with the urban drainage folks as well as the contractors, and how your program is set up.
I would say first and foremost, be gentle with us. Really, communication's a big part of what we try to do. Effective communication, good communication, developing really good partnerships. And we would look at those MS4s as our partners in this. So early communication, make sure that communication happens often, appropriate site visits, and really helping us to stay ahead of whatever the needs are from that MS4 compliance portion of the project would be really important. And we are always committed to effective erosion control and really trying to protect the environment as much as possible. Obviously, on a big project site or any project site, there's disturbance and those sort of things, but we want to do our best to try and minimize those impacts.
Yeah, so again, I think that Steve really echoes what a lot of people feel, although there are some contractors that are maybe not trying as hard as, and this is before urban drainage became the rebranded Mile High. But, especially when you do have other governmental or quasi-governmental projects come through. I know I just worked on a big water line. And they want to try to be on top of it. Their contractor wasn't always. And, this is where, again, we made sure that I wasn't having just a conversation with the contractor. I had it also with this water line company too. And so it's just really important, again, just to do that communication. And I would say early in the process, just like Steve was saying, don't wait until even the notice of intent. Let's make sure we're talking about this before we get to a stop work order. And if we get to the stop work order, we do, if that's where it has to go, great. But let's try to communicate to make sure everybody's aware that this is where it's headed. Okay. I think I also have an inspector video, and this is a little cheesy for some of us that, but the idea here is just make sure when you're doing those initial inspections or the pre-construction that you are communicating effectively to the permittee. And this is, again, why I'm a big proponent of these initial inspections. And I'm a proponent of MS4 is giving a spiel, talking about their expectations and introducing themselves. Because I think when you kind of come out of left field and no one knows who you are, you're not going to get nearly as much leverage as you're going to get if you set the stage to begin with. So I can't remember the volume on this one, but we'll go ahead and try it.
Hi, nice to meet you. I will be your MS4
Oops, sorry about that.
inspector during this construction project. I will be coming on site for a routine stormwater inspection at least every 45 days. Are you the qualified stormwater manager for this project? Great. What I would like to do now is go over the initial inspection kickoff agenda. This will cover what you can expect from me and what I expect from you. Like I said before, I will be coming out on site at least every 45 days for a routine inspection. During my routine inspection, if I find the site out of compliance, I will ask you to address the findings and respond with an operator compliance follow-up form. If I do not receive an operator compliance form within the allotted time frame, I will have to come back on site for a compliance follow-up inspection. Does all that make sense? Excellent. Next, I want to go over what I will be looking for during my inspection. First, I will need to see that you have an approved stormwater permit and a stormwater management plan on site. If it will be your responsibility to update these as construction progresses. During each inspection, I will be inspecting that your control measures are installed correctly and per your stormwater management plan. Control measures that I will be inspecting include, but are not limited to, perimeter controls, portable toilets, fuel leaks and spills, concrete washout areas, and vehicle tracking controls. I will be inspecting these measures and making sure that they are not removed, broken, or in need of maintenance. If I notice any major inadequacies or repeat issues, there might be escalations or enforcement. During this process, I want to maintain a good relationship with you, the contractor, and all the workers on site. If you have any questions or concern, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be in the email I send out with the inspection report. Any questions?
So again, you don't have to do it just like this by any means, but for those of you that haven't been a part of an initial inspection, especially with COVID, we just want to make sure you're communicating. And I think by setting up the stage this way, you really set up that professional relationship and clear expectation of what your job is and what your expectation is of the contractor. So I encourage you, you may even want to come up with a kickoff or a pre-con or initial inspection agenda. And I have a lot of municipalities where we send that out with the initial inspection also, that just goes over the things that we talked about. You can add in things like that, like salvaging topsoil. And especially if you have a program even that wants to see that salvaged topsoil during one of the first initial inspections, that can be added to it. All kinds of things can be added. If you have mud mat issues and you're not allowing mud mats or only with approval, you can talk about that. But I think it's just really helpful to have a kickoff where you do talk about those expectations. I'm going to share a lesson that I learned, and then I'm going to kind of open it up if anybody else has one, and if they don't, that's okay too. But one of the lessons I learned out there was I was on a big linear project, and the contractor had to use a biodegradable control measure. And they selected what's shown on the right here, which is, I believe it's called a type 3 sediment control log, although they call them erosion logs actually for CDOT. So in their spec, it follows the type 3 erosion logs. This is installed the way you would install any other type of wattle. This over on the left-hand side, though, is a compost log. So it is also biodegradable, but it doesn't have the same installation requirements. And your municipality can decide that they don't agree with that. But according to the manufacturer, because that compost is much heavier, and especially once it gets wet, it's really heavy. I would argue, because we haven't had precipitation in Colorado in a long time, I don't know how heavy they are right now. But theoretically, they're not supposed to need to be trenched in. The staking is also really different. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest pet peeves I have with the compost log is when they stake it through the middle and all of the compost is spilling out. So I actually prefer there is an way to use an X, where you take one of the wooden stakes and you bring it over here at a diagonal, and then you bring the other one as a diagonal, and therefore you're not puncturing the netting of the compost log. Either way is allowable in terms of the staking with the manufacturer. The big difference here, though, is the installation is different between these two products. I went out to a site and they had some, what I'm going to call sediment control log. And it had more of a white netting. And this Filtrex, actually, there's some other companies that make these compost logs that have more of a white netting. And so I just wasn't sure which product it was. So I said to the contractor, which product are you installing? They did not know. I said to them, if it's compost log, then it doesn't have to be trenched in, and you can, I would prefer you install the stakes like this with the log in the middle. If it's sediment control log or wattle, or what CDOT calls erosion log, then it needs to be trenched in and staked per detail. So the crew that was installing this did not check which product it was, and they decided on their own that it was a compost log. So they didn't trench it in, and they put the stakes in with the X formation. I then went back out for my follow-up inspection, and it was not installed correctly. I also was able to verify. I asked them to send me the product. This was the big important thing that I did that was correct. I asked them to send me the product information. I don't remember if they did or if they referred me to their vendor, but I was able to get a hold of the folks that they bought the product from. And they indeed confirmed that they were wattles and not compost logs. So then on my follow-up inspection, I had to tell them that they were installed incorrectly. They then tried to get the municipality I was working for to pay for the reinstallation because they said I had directed them. This is where you got to be careful about direction. I had directed them to install them with the crossmark staking. Luckily, I had documented the conversation and the fact that I had only told them they could have that type of staking if it was a compost log, and that they needed to verify which type of log they had. So in the end, it all worked out, but you could see how easy this could have gone in a bad direction. If I had not said the words that I said in terms of, you know, if it's this, you need to verify which product you have. And if it's this, you can install it per this detail. And if it's this, you can install it, you know, per the manufacturer detail with, you know, I would like that one type of staking. It could have gone really sideways on me. So this is why I try to emphasize in this class that we need to be careful about directing contractors. And I also think, you know, in retrospect, maybe I wouldn't have said anything at all and said, first thing I need you to do is send me the product information. And maybe that's what I should have done. I still feel like I was in an okay place, but I think it's just really important as inspectors out there, we don't want to put ourselves into a bad position and jeopardize our own, you know, career, you know, position, whatever the case may be. So you don't want to back yourself in a corner. So again, probably in retrospect, what I should have said was, please send me the product information, then we can discuss the details, you know, of how it needs to be installed. So I just throw it out there. I think Glenda had a great example with this, you know, contractor who falsely accused her of things. So I didn't know if anybody else had any kind of experience that they wanted to share. And if you don't, it's okay too. Not everybody wants to. But I thought I would share my own because I think just have to be really careful on what you're saying out there. And again, that's why I would stick to permit language, getting back to people if you don't know the answer. And in this case, I should have asked for the product information first before even talking about installation detail. Does anybody else have any stories? All right. All right, so documentation. And as I mentioned in my story, and I think in Glenda's also, you know, you need to have that documentation to back up what you're saying. So thank goodness, you know, I had put that in the inspection report that, you know, that they needed to verify which product they were using. I did also put, though, if it was compost log, you know, to use the X staking, but that's okay. You know, that's what it still saved me. Had I not documented that verbal conversation, it might have been harder in the end to diffuse what was happening. So I highly recommend documenting as much as possible, and even some of the verbal communications. For example, those minor modifications. You know, if the contractor says, hey, I want to use a Dandy product instead of the inlet protection I said I was going to use, and you say, oh, hey, that's fine. Go ahead and put that in the notes section or in your comments section in your software or wherever it is appropriate for your program. But mark down, you know, on May 18th, gave permission to use Dandy products for inlets. And that way it's documented very nicely. Or had a conversation with the contractor, explain that they were not allowed to use Dandy products, because that might be the case too. So whatever the outcome is, go ahead and document it. The notes section is a great place in your inspection reports. The other big thing with your reports is make sure you do some QA/QC. I think I am probably like most of you on the phone. I'm juggling a lot of different things at one time, and it's very easy to take a report from the previous inspection, start to fill it out, and you realize you forgot to change the date or you forgot to change something on it. So make sure if you're using an older report that you go back and you look through it and that it is correct, and that you don't send it out with an incorrection. Or if you do, very quickly say, I made a mistake, please use this revised report. It's so much better when you catch your own corrections that you need to make there. And I would say, don't wait till the end of the year to do QA/QC on your reports. And that can be hard because, again, we're super busy. But if you have, especially if you have an easy system to make sure that you're getting your reports done on time, do a query and make sure that you are hitting that every 45-day minimum for your routine inspection. Make sure that if you had non-compliant issues identified during your routine inspection, that there's a corresponding compliance inspection that was marked as approved or passing, or whatever your process is. So try not to wait till the end of the year, because that's when it stinks, when you realize, oh my gosh, especially if you have a lot of inspectors, this inspector didn't understand this and they have totally not done this right, and now we're out of compliance with the program. As I mentioned, you really want to make sure that someone can go back and look at that documentation and tell the story. So you may have a site that they were really bumpy the first year. Maybe you thought they were doing great. Then they got a new, superintendent for that project, and that the third year was horrible, and it's a long-term project. You want to go back and be able to show that that first year started off rocky, and that it's not like all of a sudden they're out of compliance. It's like maybe they've had issues in the past. And especially if, let's just say, they were only good for a week and then they went back out of compliance. Make sure you have good documentation for that. And we also know especially lately, there's been a lot of shifts in staffing for MS4 programs. And so you want to make sure that you don't leave your successor with a program where they have no idea what happened. And especially if, again, that site gets into compliance issues and there's a case being made that they're a chronic violator, but then your successor can't find any paperwork that documents that they were actually out of compliance, even though maybe they have an inspector that mentioned they were, or a coworker. So make sure you provide that documentation. All right, if a contractor asks how much silt fence, and actually this is a true story, folks. If a contractor asks how much silt fence they need in order to be in compliance, you should. And what do you think there? I'm not gonna read all of them, but I'm gonna let you read through them and you pick. And you can also, this is a great time to show you this feature. Some of you have Zoom, where you have on your toolbar an annotate button and has a little pencil. Some of you might have it as it's a view button. If you drop it down, then you get your annotate, which looks like a little pencil, and you're able to draw. So this is me up here. And we're gonna use this in just a little bit too. I can't draw very well with it, but you can also put text in. Yeah. I know. I agree with you, Martha. Sometimes I want to do A, right? You just want to be like, and the thing is, this person was actually, it wasn't a contractor, it was an HOA, which, you know, you gotta remember. And even with contractors, sometimes you think someone's trying to be like a smart aleck, and then you realize, no, they're actually being super serious. Like they really just don't understand the process. So you got to be respectful. And this is what we did. We said, look, you know, you're going to have to go back and have either one, you can get your vendor, you know, most of the time the vendors aren't going to come out and measure it though, right? Unless you have someone, the person who installs it, they may come out and measure it if you're hiring a third party. Or you're going to have to go back to the plan set and have them measure it out, or you're going to have to look for a scale bar and measure it out yourself, right? But this is a true story. Sometimes you can't make these things up. So yeah, good job, everybody. You want to be respectful. It took me a minute, actually. I was sort of like, yeah, are they serious? And they were very serious. They just had no idea. They really didn't know where to start, you know? So just remember, sometimes people they really are trying, but sometimes, and they really just don't understand the process, or they don't even know where to begin. I will tell you, I worked with a municipality that they had issues with a site, and they ended up telling the site, because the contractor honestly really didn't understand control measures, and they were always installing their own, and they didn't understand how to install them. They didn't understand the expectations for compliance. And that municipality actually required, you know, and we can all do this, to have them identify that qualified stormwater manager or guest manager, whatever your program is. And that person is supposed to be knowledgeable in stormwater practices. And if that person does not exist, you can require that they hire a third party that can meet those requirements. And that's what this municipality did. And that organization and that contractor ended up having to hire, you know, a third party to come out and do the stormwater inspections and installs. All right, yay, fun game time. We're gonna go ahead and do the game time, and then we'll take a break after that. So this is my little Jeopardy, and I actually just created one for the CIP class, and I think they're super fun. So let me go ahead and run this. And how we're gonna run it is that, you know, if we were in person, we might do teams. That's how I initially was doing it. But since we're not, what we're gonna do is I'll pick someone to lead us off. And then after that person picks the category, then the first person to answer, and it can be in the chat or unmuting, the first person to answer, they'll pick the next one. So the categories that we have today are control measure, FAQs, inspection, permit knowledge, regulatory requirements, challenging situations, which is kind of tough because it's often a little bit of a long answer, but that's okay. If we even get close, you get it right. Enforcement 101. All right, why don't we go with Andrew Rippey, because he's got an A and he's one of the first ones listed in my participant list. Do you want to pick one here?
Sure, let's do inspection permit knowledge for 200.
All right. Name 3 items that must be assessed as part of the routine inspection. And that's for anybody to answer.
This is Glenda. So all pollutant sources, all potential or offsite discharge locations, and oh geez, now I'm drawing a blank.
What about CMs?
Oh yeah, and installation of control measures.
Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely.
Brain cramp.
I know. That happens to me sometimes when I'm teaching too. I'm like, I knew what I was going to say and I've totally forgotten. But yes, So that you have to, the bottom two are the first two that Glenda started with, the illicit discharge and evaluating all pollutant sources. And then with the control measures, there's actually a couple different items within there. You have to identify if there's a failure to implement, inadequate, or if there's routine maintenance. And even though routine maintenance doesn't trigger a compliance follow-up, it is still required that you identify routine maintenance during your inspection. So good job. All right, Glenda, you want to pick the next one?
How about control measure FAQs for 300?
Maximum upgradient disturbed area per every 100 foot of sediment control without another control measure in place. So this is the drainage, upgradient drainage draining to the perimeter control. What's the maximum allowed? Anybody know?
So 1/4 acre.
Yeah. Oops, let me do this. 1/4 acre, yay. All right, Ashley, if I can get back. What do you want to pick there?
Let's do regulatory requirements for 500.
All right, going for the big bucks. So the SCP requires control measures to be selected, designed, installed, implemented, and maintained in accordance with this. It's my favorite phrase. Yeah, the site plan is true too. The
So what
swamp.
are good engineering, hydrological, and pollution prevention practices?
Yes, that's the answer we're looking for. I do agree with everyone that had swamp and site plan. The swamp itself has to be designed with good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution prevention practices. So just remember, if you as an inspector have a contractor, and I've definitely had this happen, show me where it says I have to do this. You can say, says it has to be designed with good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution prevention practices. And what I'm seeing here does not meet that criteria. It's as easy as that. So I know the first time that happened to me, I was scrambling. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know that so I had a contractor who seeded, broadcast seeded, and did not put any kind of cover on it. And they were like, show me where it says I have to put a cover. And I was like, oh my gosh, where would I find that it specifically within the MS4 regulation says that? So I was like, you know what? It's standard practice, right? And so I use this good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution prevention practices. So very helpful to use. I agree with everyone that had site plan and swamp. Those are also designed with this, but all the control measures, as well as the site plan, as well as the swamp, all have to meet this requirement. All right, and I'm so sorry, because now I've forgotten who said that.
It was Glenda.
Okay, great. Glenda, you want to pick again?
Let's do challenging situations for 100.
I can't remember which one this is. Action to be taken by the MS4 inspector if the contractor failed to implement control measures, but most of the site looked good. What would you do if you got to a site and even though the site looked great, they failed to implement some perimeter control on one side?
They failed the inspection.
Yeah, they do. You know, look, I had an inspector once that was one of our staff here at Wrightwater, and they're like, well, it looks so good, you know, and I didn't want to be discouraging. And I was like, no, you cannot, they failed. I mean, and you can absolutely in your inspection report, you know, put a note that most of the rest of the site looked really good, but you still have to document that they failed on that aspect. And I often do tell a site that looks really good and they just have one little issue. Hey, overall, the site looked really good. However, there is a deficiency. So I need you to fix that. It's going to be on the report. So that's absolutely right. All right, Joe, what do you want to pick?
Enforcement 101 for 500.
All right, we're going for another big one. I can't remember this one either. Tool to ensure that permanent, oh, this one's actually kind of easy. Tool to ensure that permanent control measures are built per design. What do we have to require now? And you may, yes, yep, it's a detail, and it's even more information than a typical detail. It's an as-built, right? So it's an as-built detail that shows what was built out there, and that then has to be compared to the original design plans. And some municipalities even require a statement that says this was built, you know, on the as-built, this was built per the approved plan, or this was built per the approved plan with the exceptions listed below. And the idea would be that those exceptions hopefully were very minor. And this one's a little, I have to decide if I'm going to keep this one in. We don't really talk about permanent water control measures in this class as much, but do know, and this is something that I mentioned last week when we were talking about sediment basins, that potentially we're going to be extended detention basins later, is that you do need to make sure that you are observing the construction, like during the construction of that permanent feature, you know, at least be marking notes in your inspection report if you don't have a separate checkbox item for that or a separate form. That's something also to watch on this phase 2 renewal, to see what language is going to be in the renewal process. All right. Let's see, I'll just pick somebody else since that one was a tough one. Sorry, I'm just looking for a name. How about Chancey?
How about regulatory requirements for 300?
All right. Name 3 types. Oh, this is another permanent water quality. There's only a couple of them, but this is the other one. Name 3 types of permanent water quality control measures. And there are lots of them, more than 3, but this one just asks for 3. It is really important as MS4 inspectors, even if though you're doing mostly construction, you do need to be familiar with what our permanent water stormwater control measures are.
EDB, sand filter basin, and grass swale.
Yeah, those are good ones. So we got the EDB, most commonly used. I will tell you, with the draft EDB that's out from Mile High Flood District, they are no longer recommending EDBs used for drainage areas that are less than 5 acres.
Yep.
So I think we're going to be seeing a lot more bioretention and infiltration type swales and stuff. Yeah, we've got rain garden, permeable pavers, storm tech, those underground stormwater facilities, absolutely. All right, we're going to do one more. I think, Joe, I think that was you.
Yeah. Inspection permit knowledge for 500.
All right, let's see what we put in here. Oh yeah, this one's kind of tough, although this is one that does affect for sure Castle Pines. 4 requirements for individual homes that were part of a bigger, you know, a big common plan of development to be excluded from MS4 oversight inspections per the MS4 permit. And I think this is also in the SCP permit, or portions of it are in the SCP, not all of it. Yep, someone's got less than an acre. That's right. So that's one of them. How about?
Sold to the homeowner.
Yep, sold to the homeowner. Yep, taken out of the swamp. So the permittee needs to mark down that that's been taken out. CO issued. So there's 4 altogether, and I'll tell you, there's a really big 5th one that this only asked for 4, so we met it. But the big one is this last bullet. The residential development site must have a permit approved site plan that's still inspected. And this one's super challenging, everyone, because everyone wants to close their permits out. So if that developer got a big overlot grading permit, in order for those lots to be taken out, either the overlot grading permit has to be in place still, or the builder has other lots that are still active and they still have a permit for the area. But someone needs to have an overall permit for the area still for where the lot is located. Now, if it's the last lot that's stabilized, then you could close out the whole permit, assuming everything outside of the lot has reached final stabilization. Any questions on that? I had a custom home builder who wanted to get out of their permit, and the problem is they weren't part of a common plan of development, so there was no residential over lot permit, or one that's being held by the builder, because it was only for one lot and it had to do with proximity to waterways, so that's the only reason it was permitted. But yeah, I couldn't let them out. I said they either needed to hold on to the permit or it had to be transferred to the homeowner, because apparently the homeowner was doing all the landscaping. But in that case, you can't close it because there is no sort of over development type of permit that's overseeing that area in general. All right, we'll go to the very last thing here, the final Jeopardy. And this class helps meet what requirements in the MS4 permit?
Training.
Yay, training.
Training.
So I am going to be sending out the sign-in sheet from this class, and everyone can use that. You might want to give that if you're not your MS4 coordinator. You might want to give that to your MS4 coordinator, because absolutely this is great training. You'll also get a certification once you finish the exam. So it really is, even though a lot of you maybe knew a lot of stuff, this might have been a lot of review for you. It's really helpful to do these kind of classes and to keep up the training. And for those of you that are new, I'm really hoping you got a lot out of it. And then also this training really can help demonstrate that you are knowledgeable in stormwater practices. I always encourage people though to get on site training, but as well as taking these kind of courses, going to conferences, attending, maybe the construction committee stuff. I think it's a great networking opportunity. There are all kinds of conferences that those folks go to. And so just lots of opportunities there. All right, let's go ahead and take a break. Just going to do a 5-minute break here, just in the idea of we'll finish a little early. I'm going to give a little time. I'm hoping for people to actually do the exam today before they have to go back to their other assignments for the day. But also people will have all the way until Friday to send me the exam. It's pretty straightforward, multiple choice, but I want to give as much time as needed to anyone that needs it. But what I'm hoping is don't make me chase you for your exam. So if by Friday I don't have it, I will do that. But if you could possibly get it to me by Friday, that'd be great. All right, so we have a little bit more when we get back, but let's come back. Let's just say at 10:35. Okay, welcome back. I am just trying to get the email ready for later that I'll send everybody. If for any reason I don't send an email to you, reach out to me to make sure that we need to send you the exam, or if you need to watch part of part 1 and then reach back out to me after you've done that, I can have you do the exam. So in this next part, before we jump into the exam, we are going to talk about common non-compliance issues on site. And so I'm hoping everyone can use their fancy annotate button, and we can mark down in these photos like where we see problems. And we'll talk about the pollutant sources and then kind of what the control measures are that are associated with them. So as an inspector, you can kind of circle all the things that would jump out to you as we go through each slide. So the number one complaint, yeah, no problem. So Yeah, and if you need to watch this recording afterwards, that's fine. Just let me know that you finished it, and I'll get you the exam, then we'll get you the certification. But yeah, so go ahead and start marking these things up. So you can do things like here, yep, got issues. Yep, great job. So I would agree, you know, on this top, the upper right-hand side, we don't just have tracking, right? We've got tracking out to the pavement. We've got no control measure in place. And can you just say, I'm sweeping? Is it okay to say, oh, I'm not going to put in any vehicle tracking control because I've just decided to sweep instead?
No.
No. And you hear that all the time. I just heard it the other day from someone. And I said, no, I'm sorry, that is not adequate. So you must have some kind of tracking control pad. And then in this case, I agree, there's no funneling onto that pad. It's sort of a free-for-all anywhere you wanted to exit out of the site. So the number one complaint you are going to get from the public is going to be about sediment tracking, especially when big clods of mud get, unfortunately, we haven't had mud in a long time, which is not so good for our vegetation, but has made it easier for a lot of contractors that are working in the area. But that's the number one complaint. So we need to make sure that they have appropriate control measures in place. Here, another non-compliant issue, inlet protection. What's going on in these photos? And perimeter control, sorry, I shouldn't leave that out. Yeah, and I just saw a silt fence like this lower right just the other day. And it's not a serious issue, but it can't function as designed the way it is, especially if there's a big gap between it. So this is where you're going to have to use your judgment on, is it routine maintenance or is it inadequate in current condition? And again, unless that bottom piece is able to stay in place during a storm event, then it's going to be inadequate. If you think that the bottom is fine and it's just the very top, then perhaps it could be routine maintenance. Yeah, I love here, right? This was inlet protection. They had a modified detail so that they had the concrete blocks orientated this way. So that piece was fine in this inlet, but then they placed this really muddy, awful manhole right above it that has all this, pollutant sources on it. Yeah, and then this one's tough, they do have a gap in here. They do have silt fence though. So I don't know, on this one, I'm just not sure in the middle. If you have the silt fence behind the concrete, you'll have to evaluate this. Perhaps it is adequate, but then I see pieces of rock and stuff in here that wouldn't be, right?
Yeah, I circled it because those are crushed.
Crushed rock?
No, crushed cinder blocks.
Oh, crushed cinder blocks.
Those don't look intact.
I agree. Crushed cinder blocks, no good. And then if this rock, a lot of times what I see too on this rock sock is it'll be broken. And so that means the control measure itself is acting like the pollutant source, right? The crushed concrete blocks, any rock, if this were to be broken. So sounds good. Okay, stockpiles, spoil piles. Some of these might be okay. Some of them might not be. I think the two bottom pictures really amplify knowing your program's requirements. Some municipalities require there be control measures around the stockpile. I think it should only be on the down gradient side. I sometimes see things that are just not worded super well that indicate it has to be around the entire pile. Really, I think it's the down gradient side, but then other people have requirements that if it's in close proximity to a perimeter control, that maybe it doesn't need it around the pile. So again, know your program's requirements, and then make sure you look at the drainage. If the drainage is towards us in this lower left-hand picture, we may need to have additional controls there. This is really great. This upper right-hand side, we don't have any controls at all, right? This is just a mess, and it's interacting with water and moving. and being transported. So even though there's silt fence way back here, that is not going to be adequate. And then here, you know, we've got great perimeter controls on this side. What do we have on the other side? And this is where, as an inspector, you need to go look, right? Because if they have a trench on the other side, it's possible they're fine. The other thing I would recommend, you know, as just an added layer of protection is maybe some curb socks here as they go. Although that can be tough when they're driving in that area, but they could hopefully avoid them. Stockpiles, you know, also one of the best controls is if you don't have to have it on site because you're exporting it anyway, don't even have it to begin with. Put it directly into a dump truck. All right, here we've got waste management, concrete. Yeah, I love that one, right? Everyone jumped to that one because it's just so awful where they've got this washout like in the middle of the road. And it's not even constructed properly. Plus it should not be. I mean, now they've got a pile in the road and the waste. So that's really bad. You know, and I'm a big proponent of these prefabricated mobile washouts, but you still need to have some controls around them. They can be messy and they shouldn't leak, but often things can be spilled. So it's a really good idea to extend. I think a lot of people had an extension there on that silt fence or whatever kind of perimeter control. And yeah, you know, this lower right-hand side, this is something I see all the time where the concrete gets dumped not inside the excavated area, but actually on the lip of it where it can run down. Waste material, the one in the lower left, I actually think was a good picture. They had very clear signage for all their different dumpsters. It was really well done. I think I mentioned this last week. It might have been on our control measure slide that this was over by Union Station when they were expanding it. It was a very clean site. Yeah, so the two that really have a lot of issues here are over on the right-hand side, probably have the most issues. And Jake, I'm trying to see what you're, like maybe something to pull it.
It's a smiley face.
Oh, a smiley face. I love it. Yeah, they did a good job. And, you know, please do try to remember that. It's really hard for us as inspectors to remember to compliment the good sites. But we need to try to do that because it's so much, it makes our jobs much easier, right? And it's wonderful to see sites that are really overall doing well. So remember to give them a thumbs up or a smiley face. This middle picture, this was a custom home builder that I have been struggling with. And actually I have a couple more that are worse. And this one came up with this idea of using the big reds with the plastic, and I was fine with it. I agree the plastic though should really go over the whole entire big red here. And the flow, which you can't really tell very easily from this photo, but it is really towards us. And so it wasn't going to drain back towards the house. But it just is a nice way to have some kind of containment for your stucco washout areas. And I do find that maybe doing some more public education or targeted education for stucco contractors would be a good idea, because a lot of these folks just aren't used to putting their mixing stations in a contained area. And this was pretty cheap to construct. This person already had the big reds on site. They had plastic. It really was not hard. I've also seen people do this with compacted earth and berms with the plastic too, and it can be very effective. I don't know about other people, but I've been struggling with custom home builders right now. And I think it's because they haven't been regulated a whole lot in the past, to be honest with you, because they're not the national home builders. These are the ones building just this on the single lot, but maybe it's a 35-acre lot, disturbing more than an acre, or they're part of a subdivision of custom homes that are, you know, multi-million-dollar custom homes and the lots are only about an acre, but they're part of common plan of development. So regardless of the fact, because I had one that they were like, well, we're only disturbing 0.9, acres. And I was like, well, it doesn't matter because you're in the middle of this filing that's all being developed by different custom home builders. So you're going to have to get a permit, and it has been a struggle. So yeah, good housekeeping, secondary containment, everybody has got this. And this one on the bottom with the generator, I didn't think this was so bad. I'm wondering what people had there. Was maybe not enough. That I can't tell in the bottom actually if that's just the tarp or if it's, I'm not sure or if it's just a shadow. Yeah, so it is a berm. So this has a berm, this generator had plastic, and then they had a compacted berm, and then the plastic was over some of it, but they put dirt over the top of it too. I think mostly just to hold the plastic in place too, and to beef up the berm. Okay. Lack of temporary stabilization. Somebody hit this when they were talking about inadequate control measures. This is a big one that I've been hitting. I think this time of year, we really, as inspectors, we need to be talking to our sites if they haven't been active in areas for more than 14 days. What is their schedule for seeding? And of course, it's not been super favorable with the dry weather we've been having, but we can't wait. I think now some people do wait. I will throw that out there until the fall to seed, but then they need to do some kind of hydro mulching or something. You can't just leave it in a surface roughened condition from now until September. In my mind, that doesn't meet the good engineering, hydrologic, and pollution prevention practices. Yeah, so I love that people got this on this surface roughening. This one's super hard. They did the right thing. You can kind of see the cleat marks are this way, but because of the way they did it, they've really got all of these up and down marks. And that's actually going to promote erosion. And I would say that the up and down the hill lines are more prominent than the contours. Oops, sorry about that. I don't know where. There we go. So I agree. That's a good call on that one. That's where it's really tough because that contractor's trying, they just did not do it the right way. So again, a detail could be really helpful there. Mile High Flood District has, and so does CDOT, a pretty good detail showing the equipment and the cleat marks. And you can show them, yeah, it looks like you tried to do the cleat marks the right way, but I don't know, whatever caused that to have so many up and down marks, you definitely don't want.
I had that conversation last week before with a very prominent developer here in Castle Pines. They really tried to do the right thing and track, but it was the wrong way. And I actually had to draw a picture because they just couldn't grasp what I was talking about.
No, I actually think a lot of people don't. And I think it is really helpful. I think a lot of us are also visual learners. And like, as soon as you see this picture, I think it kind of brings it home. These are the cleat marks, right? But you need to be careful. See, I think what also does happen too, which is not great, especially with bulldozer type of equipment, is from the track, you sometimes can get a line from the edge of the track. That's not the cleat marks, it's the edge of the, whatever I'm sure there's an official name for what holds that tracking on there. So they have to be kind of careful about that. But yeah, it's really important because they actually promote erosion if they do it the wrong way. So it's the opposite of what you want. Ideally, I kind of like if you can do it with some kind of a tilling machine. This really only happens where I've seen it happen the most is oil and gas, because they go out there and they often pay an agricultural person that's nearby to go out there and till it for them, even without doing the seeding, just to roughen it up. All right, Now we're going to jump into enforcement. And so everyone has to have an enforcement program. You really need to know what your enforcement program is for your organization, because it's really, it is really different for many different organizations. And for non-standards that might be joining us today, you know, it tends to be a lot with your contract. And so you want to make sure that you write that in to your SOP or whatever you're using, your program description document. But a lot of times you'll have contractual obligations. In addition, entities like CDOT, which also is more contract-based, they have liquidated damages. And so you may want to think about having something like that. You can certainly also close, you know, do a stop work. The hard part about the stop work is just that it's your own project, right? But the contractor doesn't get paid for those days. So, you know, it's a delay for them. And I think that, you know, it can happen, although I do think that more frequently it's more done through the contract. So that's something for non-standards to really look at. It's also something for CIP projects to be thinking about is, you know, what other mechanisms do you have? Because you can't always use the exact same enforcement for capital improvement projects as you do for private. Because for private, oh, you know, it's the end of the world if it's stop work. You know, it's just different if it's a CIP because it's your own project. So it's got implications to the municipality as well. But that doesn't mean that CIPs get to do what they want. For sure they don't. And that's the reason we developed that CIP training, is because there was a realization that sometimes it's actually our CIP projects that are lagging behind the private for compliance. So we want to make sure that, you know, not only should they be meeting all of the requirements, they really should be role models, because I do know that other contractors do see them and they will point them out like, oh, you know, you're telling me I have to do this, but I just drove by that sanitary sewer project down the road and they didn't have any controls, you know? So we really have to make sure that they are following suit and being role models for the municipal program. That being said, what does their enforcement look like? Because you do have issues on CIP projects. You know, what's the escalation there? Do you have the ability to do liquidated damages where you could actually come in and fix things and charge? You know, how does that look for your municipality? And for everyone, that might be different. But at a minimum, you have to have an enforcement program. It has to be described in your program documents. And as an inspector, you need to be aware of what your enforcement program is. I know there are a lot of municipalities that have been using re-inspection fees when inspectors have to come back out to the site, and that can be really effective, even if it's not very much money. What you'll find is the contractors don't want to pay it, even a small amount, if they can avoid it. And how they avoid it is by being in compliance or fixing things right away and getting photos if that's what your program allows. The other big thing with your enforcement program is you do have to identify if you have chronic or recalcitrant violators. And so I wanted to spend just a few moments talking about what is chronic first, and then we'll talk about recalcitrant, because they aren't the same. I know in some of our regulatory framework, we see them listed together, but they're not always the same. They can be, and that's fine if they are, but they can also be separated. So for chronic, that's also really complicated, because it's just like that whole thing about the non-standard language with the 3 consecutive routine inspections having follow-ups. What does that mean? Do you mean if it's always the same item, or do you mean if you find new items? So for chronic, I've been working with the council, Stormwater Council, and what we've come up with is there's 2 different types of chronic violations. One can be the exact same spot and the exact same control measure that just every time is out of whack, and therefore may need to be reevaluated whether it's the proper control for that location. But then the second type of chronic is that the whole site just always has items. They might be different items, but you're always having a really, you know, pretty negative report at the end in terms of a lot of non-compliant issues every time you go out on the site. So this first picture, it's the first item, the first type of chronic violation, which is the same location, same control measure, repetitively being out of compliance. So here we have December 3rd, broken bag. They totally went and fixed it. So here's the thing. They had a photo also, which we really need to show, but I don't have, unfortunately, that it was fixed. And then on the 7th, it's the exact same problem again, where it was broken and it had been replaced. So this control measure keeps showing up on inspections every single time. To me, that's a big sign that it's not the right control measure for that location. So what do you all think? If you had to give some compliance assistance to this permittee, what would you say to them? Do you think they should just replace the rock sock again? Yeah. So, yep. Alternative control, absolutely. You could replace it with a dandy bag or something that's below the grade, right? Because clearly this appears to be at the end of some kind of a driveway. You can see tire marks actually all over, and it's being run over every time. So it needs to be replaced, you know, and you don't always have to say a specific product, but you can say it needs to be a proprietary product. They sell those and it can fit on the grate and drop below it. If they ask for any products you think might work, you know, then you could throw out some products that are out there, and certainly dandy bags are one. Then you also have the site where every time you go, it kind of looks like this, right? It's just a mess. And it's not always the same location that's a mess, but overall, you can just know that you're going to find numerous items on your inspection report, because every time you go, the whole site is just not well cared for, not well thought out, and doesn't have appropriate control measures. So this might be a chronic violator also. So when you do your inspections, you do need to be identifying and looking for chronic violations. And then if you are experiencing a site that has chronic violations, you do need to start to escalate enforcement. Even if it is, you know, one area and the same location and the same control measure, it still gets escalated. And I tell people that right away. So like that rock sock, if I came back the second time, it's the exact same rock sock, I would say, I just want you to know, this is now becoming a chronic violation. If I come back a third time and you haven't replaced this with some other type of control measure and the rock sock is here and it's broken, I'm going to have to write, you know, a notice of non-compliance, a notice of violation, whatever your program requires you to write. But again, it's that communication. Often when you have that communication up front, by the time you come back, you'll find that hopefully it's been replaced and it's not an issue. So what's the difference between chronic and recalcitrant? Chronic just means that it's always out of compliance, right? And recalcitrant can also often be out of compliance, but it's also that they're not listening to what you're saying. They're not fixing what you've told them to fix. When you've identified a non-compliant item, they have not addressed it. That's recalcitrant. So I can tell you, I've had a lot of sites that they're not recalcitrant, but they are chronic violators. And that's a little different. So you want to be careful in your wording, in that if they're not recalcitrant, meaning that they're not responding to your inspection reports, they're not addressing non-compliance, then they're not recalcitrant. But if they are chronically, like their site just always looks bad, or you have that one rock sock or a mud mat that really should be not a mud mat, that's going to be chronic. A lot of times what we find with our recalcitrant players is not only are they not listening to us, they're also chronic violators, and that the site's typically a mess. So often they can be recalcitrant and chronic. I just know I've had quite a few folks that they're not recalcitrant, even if they are chronic. They've really been trying, but they're also only trying after and reacting to my inspection report instead of doing their own inspection reports and reacting to those. And I've said that to them, you know, you're going to be a chronic violator if we keep going down this path. I need you to be, you know, more, I know you always fix everything every time I come out, but every time I come out, I have a laundry list. And that's, you know, that's starting to meet that definition of a chronic violator. All right, all kinds of problems here with illicit discharges. So, sometimes illicit discharges are going to warrant a stronger response. So in your enforcement program, instead of going through all the steps you might typically go through for a project that, let's say, failed to implement something and has inadequate control that they didn't then fix, with a discharge, an actual discharge that's happened on site, you may end up, instead of giving that warning notice or just coming back for a compliance inspection, you might move right to, a notice of violation or potentially a stop work order if it's severe. So, everyone has different stuff in their program. And I don't know if anyone has anything. I do know, I think I saw Jake on, I really like Westminster has a program where they actually, you have to come in, if you get this notice of enforcement action, you can come in. Oh, and I know Jake's with Arvada now, and I always mix that up. But when Jake was with Westminster, he helped put together this program. And the folks would come in, if they got this notice, they could appeal and come in and try to speak to their case of why they shouldn't get this notice of enforcement action. But the enforcement action was actually taking into account what the cost would have been had they installed everything that they should have installed, and then charging the contractor a fee for all of the things that they didn't install at the right time. And I thought that was it was a pretty great way to do it. And they had to come up, they also had a mandatory hearing to speak to all of that too. And they could appeal it again, to try to plead their case. And also they could go to the hearing and try to plead their case of, there was a big rain, there was a 5-year event, or whatever the case might be. And they might be able to get it down, but they still ended up with a pretty big fine. Does anybody?
I definitely recommend. It's known as an administrative enforcement process, and it really just allows you to handle that kind of enforcement in-house instead of handing it over to the courts during like a judicial process. So yeah, if you can find a way to put that into your ordinance, I recommend it.
Yeah, so kind of to reemphasize what Jake was saying, this isn't you go to court, because I know like in Denver, you have to go to court, but you actually have to go to municipal court. I mean, I think you're kind of in with everybody and their brother. This is an administrative process. And Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, is it with engineering and public works specifically?
Yeah, so Westminster was a little weird because the engineering was within community development, but it stays within that department.
Mm-hmm. And that makes it easier to kind of control the process too. So just something to think about. Again, at this training, we like to share ideas of what worked really well for municipalities. I do know there have been a lot of municipalities that I am aware of that they have held up the COs. And that's really big, especially for the big subdivisions that are going in out there, that if there are big issues, and with a builder, you'll start to hold up those COs and you are going to see some shifts pretty quickly, especially in today's market.
Hey, Jen, this is Ashley with the town of Firestone. Just speaking to another administrative tool that we use, not necessarily to garner fines, but we do require a separate performance security for the stormwater permit that's based on a cost opinion of the control measures. And then if during our inspections, we find that they're not, adequately protecting the site from pollutants leaving it, we can draw from that performance security without any formal process. And it's just at the determination of the town engineer or the town engineer's representative, which would be me. And it's very effective. It's also an effective tool in getting permits to seed and issue final stabilization, because their performance security will not be released in full until final stabilization is established.
Yeah, that's a great tool out there. And so I think everyone, if you don't already have some kind of financial assurity money, it really does help. Some people have that assurity, but they're not easily able to get to it. So that's the other thing, just to make sure that you actually could go out. Like if you've been fighting with the contractor about inlet protection, if you are able to really easily get to that money and fix it, and you have the ability to have crews that work for your organization that can go fix it, or you have a contract, an on-call kind of contract with a vendor who does that kind of work, and you can call them in and you send them the bill showing that it's been paid out of their security. I imagine you get really change in attitude there about how quick they're going to fix things.
Oh, yeah, no, 100%. And just to be clear, because I know that there are sureties for developments like public improvements and things like that. And this is completely separate. And the town of Firestone also doesn't accept performance bonds. So only letter of credit and only cash. It's very easy to draw upon. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because also when you draw upon that, that's going to trigger the fact for the higher ups of whoever is issuing these letter of credits that it's being drawn, and perhaps more scrutiny on what's going on with that project. I like to, someone has in the chat, holding up, if that developer has a bunch of developments within the community, holding up their other development reviews until they get that site in order. Makes a lot of sense to me. So in the non-standard permit, they do get a little more prescriptive. They actually say that they must use the following types of enforcement mechanisms or their equivalent. I think the big caveat is their equivalent. You could argue that there are equivalents maybe of some of this, although, yeah, I think this is kind of tough because, maybe you're not using one of these. So then how does that work? I think, again, this is where it's just a little challenging sometimes in the permit, because I understand they want to be prescriptive, but like that, using the performance bond, I think that's a great leverage right there, and that's not, it's in the administrative at the end, but you will want to make sure you do have at least the ability to do these other pieces if it's in your permit. The other thing I'll note is that they do discuss in the non-standard permit that you must have several of these items outlined and defined in your PDD, which also potentially could mean, if you're using a PDD more as a table of content, which is what I think most people are doing, and then it's pointing to a standard operating procedure for your construction program, you do want to make sure that you're not too general. You want to stay a little general usually in those SOPs, but you do want to make sure that you have defined all these things in your program documents. This is also from the non-standard permit. So again, probably likely to see in the phase 2 permit renewal, is that it's very prescriptive, is that you must escalate enforcement if non-compliance has continued at the site for more than 2 inspections. I actually don't have much of a problem with that piece, because I think most of us are doing that. And in fact, I think the 2 inspections would probably be more like compliance follow-up type inspections, and where it's escalating already, right? Like you go out there, and then after that first compliance re-inspection, if the item isn't done, you're already starting to escalate. And then if you come out there again and it's still not done, you're definitely moving into escalation. But it does give the exception that, of course, if they've taken steps to minimize or prevent the discharge until an inadequate control measure is replaced or corrected or returned to working order, then that could be acceptable. The inadequate control measure must not have resulted in 24-hour reporting requirements. So those are the exceptions. That makes sense to me. So for example, say you couldn't seed for some reason, they don't have the seed mix, you couldn't seed. So your contractor, the permitted contractor comes to you and says, I can't seed. And you say, well, you're going to need to put down either hydromulch, surface roughening, whatever your program's going to want to have in place there until you can get it seeded. And then they give you a schedule for that. And they excuse me, and they haven't had a discharge that resulted in the requirement of needing to report it because they had a discharge of pollutants into a waterway, then I think, that does give you some leeway to be able to work with them on that. And that does happen. So good to know that's out there. And then this is also new for the non-standard permit. So if the Water Quality Control Division, which is CDPHE, or an EPA inspection is done on a project site within your municipality or your MS4 boundary, if there's a written requirement for that permittee, to respond back to one of those regulatory entities with a written report, within 30 days of being notified by one of those entities. So the onerous does go on to the regulatory agency to notify the non-standards. Then they'll ask the non-standards to review and provide any inspection reports for that area that they had. And then what they're going to look at is those inspection reports and determine, if there should also be non-compliance with the local construction program. Likely, but not always, there might have already been enforcement that was already started on a local level. And so you would want to convey that to these regulatory agencies. And again, this isn't going to be for every inspection that the division does, or CDPHE. It would only be for sites where they had enough findings that they're requiring the permittee to respond back with a written response. This one thing I'll just note on this, I had someone, might have actually been in this class last week. I also taught the CIP stormwater class not that long ago, that asked if you should walk the site whenever there is an inspection by EPA or CDPHE. And I think for this reason, this is another reason to think about walking that site. Again, you're not necessarily being evaluated. It's the permit holder for the SCP permit. But I think it's not a bad idea to gauge, how many findings that regulatory agency is having in order to just, make sure you're thinking about it in terms of your own reports. And perhaps even you after the walk would write up your own report too. It's up to you. You don't have to by any means, but, or maybe you go out the next day and do your own inspection. Just something to think about. All right, we're going into the last segment here, which is final stabilization. The big thing that has changed here, and I can't remember, but I thought I highlighted it. Yep, right here. This is now in the non-standard permit. So for all of you who are sort of thinking, in my phase 2 permit, it still doesn't say this, so I'm not really enforcing on it. Just know this is going to likely also be in the phase 2 permit, that final stabilization will be defined as providing at least 70% of what would have been provided by native vegetation in a local undisturbed area or an adequate reference site. Contractors have still not really caught on to this. And the problem is a lot of times they might need to use an adequate reference site. For me, I tend to look at the surrounding area. And so, that can be the adequate reference site, but really they're supposed to, in their swamps, be stating that that's, state what they're using as their reference site. So if they have things like prairie dogs, or if they're in like a very industrial area that was road-based to begin with, and then maybe some limited vegetation, they should, that's probably not ever going to meet the requirement of native vegetation in a local undisturbed area, and they should likely have used an adequate reference site. I would highlight to you, this might be something where you want to talk to your CIP managers, because they definitely are going to want to be thinking of this. If they're having the contractor write the swamp, they're going to want to think about this. If they're having the designers write the swamp, they're going to want to make sure their designers are aware of this criteria, so they indicate if they're using an adequate reference site and where is the adequate reference site. I don't think we're going to make I personally don't like this definition at all. I think we're not going to make any traction in changing it because it's in a lot of permits now. And also the EPA construction general permit uses similar language.
I know in Colorado Springs, as part of their consent decree and redoing their SOPs, the state made them, Colorado Springs actually wanted to have a grid, and that would determine what pre-disturbance. You put a grid down, you'd be able to take a picture of it. The state actually didn't want the grid, but now in Colorado Springs, they have to take pictures of pre-disturbance vegetation, and both the city's inspector and the swamp admin for the site have to come to an agreement on what the density of that is, and both physically sign off on what pre-disturbance vegetation density and makeup was. And that drives permit closure at the end, because they go back to that agreed upon pictures.
Yeah, what's interesting to me with that, which is that kind of still goes back into pre-disturbance versus post-disturbance versus mimicking native vegetation in a local undisturbed area. So in a way, that's kind of good news, I guess, but it's interesting that they like that approach.
And Jen, just to touch on another point, this is Ashley with Firestone. I think this is another instance where it's important for the MS4 inspector to be familiar with the program. This is also a really good opportunity for those programmatic documents to state what the MS4 program has decided to use, whether you're just going with 70% or a method of what they've determined is, an adequate reference site, because then, if they start looking at your inspections to determine if your inspections are adequate, it's going to touch more on the programmatic thing. So just a point of reference for any coordinators, just make sure you document in your MS4 construction program, document what you've determined as an adequate reference site.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because a lot of people probably wrote their documents before this language came about, and they have that 70% of pre-disturbance, which in my mind is different than what this is saying, this language from the permit. And I do think that if you're in an area that's never going to be native representing, I mean, it doesn't have to be native. Well, they indicate it sort of should be, but they just indicate it's the coverage, right, that would be provided by native vegetation in local undisturbed area. But they do earlier, especially in the state SCP permit, they talk about perennial and uniform. But I think it's really important for inspectors that you are clear about what the expectation is here, so that you're feeling like you've met all the documentation requirements when you go to close out a site. The other big thing when you do a closeout is that make sure all of the temporary control measures have been removed. There is a caveat for biodegradable, but I'll tell you, like a lot of municipalities that I've worked with, they are not allowing, even if it's biodegradable, the wattles to remain in place. And I am actually a big proponent of that, because those stakes, the wooden stakes in this climate, they're not going to biodegrade anytime soon. And the netting sometimes biodegrades, sometimes takes a long time, and it does alter the local flow path. And so really, if it's not needed, it, in my opinion, should all be taken out. The exception would be blankets. You never take out blankets unless they're falling apart. But those typically are left in place, and the vegetation comes through, and they do biodegrade in a much better fashion. But yeah, I don't particularly personally don't like leaving any kind of compost log or wattle in place. But again, know your program. Some folks at CDOT like leaving it in, and the way the permit's written, if it's biodegradable, they can. Make sure you just know all the different types of stabilization that could be used. Some of it is vegetative, some of it is hard surfacing. If you are having different methods that you allow in your community, make sure you know which ones you allow and which ones you don't. Some municipalities do not allow spray-on products. Some allow them with approval, but only with approval. So just make sure you know your municipality and what they require. And then again, communication. Try to communicate to the contractor way before the seeding happens on if you don't allow certain practices such as a spray-on product. Otherwise, you'll come out there and you'll find that you have hydro mulch everywhere, and they might have spent a fair amount of money and didn't understand that they weren't supposed to do it. So I think, again, really try to communicate. It's not your job to convey all of your requirements. They should also be aware of them, but I think it really helps if you can try to be proactive in that. These are just some of the things that I've seen over the years, not implementing the stabilization in a timely fashion. I can't tell you how many people I have who want to get it in before the snow flies, but then they're pushing construction and they're pushing their schedule. And then the next thing you know, it totally, turns into December and frozen conditions and they can't get it done. And then they have to come back in the spring, but they didn't even meet the window of getting the hydromulch down. And so it's just really problematic. So, that's where I try in September to start talking to people about when are you scheduled to seed? When is it going to happen? And just really emphasizing that they need to get that hydromulch down if they don't make the seeding. The other big thing is if they are doing any kind of a spray-on product, and if your municipality allows hydraulic seeding, they really need to do that as a two-step process and not just combine the seeding and the mulch. Especially in this climate, you're probably not going to get good results, and it's going to be a big waste of money for everyone. I personally am not a big fan of the hydraulic seeding. I don't mind hydraulic mulch, but I'm not a fan. I have not seen good results with hydraulic seeding. So, again, see what, if you're seeing that in your community, maybe you want to make a rule that you're not allowing it without approval. Over-compacted soils, it says it in the SCP permit that they're, unless infeasible, they're not supposed to over-compact, but, we're going to have haul routes, we're going to have staging areas. So if they do over-compact, I really wish the permit said, if you do over-compact, then, have a plan to decompact the soils, because that's really what needs to happen. Because in the areas where it's not feasible because of the nature of construction, then you need to make sure it is decompacted before you seed. It's so sad when I see seed that just gets broadcasted over these really compacted areas, and then they do some hydromulch. I'm like, there's no way that is going to grow at all. Oh, I don't know about hydrocomposting. So that, I know we're trying to do more composting here in Colorado, although you got to be careful in Cherry Creek with the nutrient levels, but the hydrocomposting, that could be a great thing. That sounds really good to me. I think, Chad, have you been having good success that you've been seeing after people use the hydrocomposting? And he might have to type in. I think he might have been somebody that didn't have a, so we'll let him type in. But, I think we're always looking for good ideas to how to promote vegetation here, especially in these really dry times. Yeah, so that the information looks like that hydro composting worked really well. Oh, nice. And it looks like Ashley just approved it for their first site. So I definitely encourage you, especially if you have a developer that's willing to try something new. I'm sure it's not absolutely cheap, but what I try to tell the developer is that it's not cheap to keep doing inspections for years and years and then having to come back and reseed. So you may want to think about setting this up for success to begin with. And if you can use things like soil amendments and hydro composting, it sounds like, you may have a much better chance of getting your permit closed out. And then, of course, with home builders, they want it to look good too, right? I mean, they're still often selling houses in the area. And who wants to have an area that just looks, like weeds and only sparsely vegetated? The other big one that I see is not covering. That's that argument I had with the contractor of not putting a cover on top of seed. Here in Colorado, we absolutely have to. It'll either, get totally desiccated and dry out, or it'll be blown away. It'll just fry in the sun. It doesn't make sense to spend the money on seeding and not to cover it with either some kind of a mulch or a blanket. And then the other thing I see sometimes is people, spending a bunch of money on topsoil, they spread it out there, and then weeks and weeks go by. And you're like, where's the seeder? Oh, we didn't get on their schedule, and now they're like a month out. So in the meantime, this spread compost is completely baking in the sun and also being washed away if we ever have precipitation, or blown away, which is probably more the case these days. So CDOT actually has a great spec for this, that you have to complete all the operations, I believe, within 48 hours once you place that topsoil down. And that makes sense to me. It does not make sense to me, and this is where sometimes there's a disconnect between the subs, and they'll have the contractor place this topsoil, and then the sub isn't available for a month and a half. All right, anything else that anybody wants to add for final stabilization? All right, we'll move on to CIP. So these can be really tricky projects. And what you need to make sure is, how are they inspected? Is it the same, inspectors that are doing your private? Are they different inspectors? Do they have the same level of training? I did an audit for a municipality where they had their right-of-way people who didn't normally do stormwater work, do CIP projects, and they just didn't have the proper training. And there was a lot of confusion between the contractor and the right-of-way inspector on who was doing what, because the right-of-way inspector is often taking daily inspections, but really of the right-of-way. And yes, they'll throw in some stormwater stuff, but it's not on the proper form, nor is it the proper scope of an MS4 inspection. And it certainly didn't meet the SCP inspection, and the contractor thought they were, responsible for all inspections. So really important you're having those communications up front. Also, thing that can be really hard is sometimes the MS4 inspector has to wear not only the MS4 inspector hat, but sometimes they have to inspect it for the state. And that can be really challenging. I really highly recommend that not happen, because if you're aware of non-compliance, you actually really put the construction program in jeopardy unless you're also documenting it there and then enforcing and escalating per that program. So I really think it's a better idea not to do it. The only times that I think that possibly it could be okay is once you've already seeded. But again, as soon as you know about non-compliance as the SCP inspector, you're going to have to follow that back up within your MS4 program too, if you're wearing that hat also. And it happens, and I'm well aware, and it's a situation where most people don't want to be in, but I think other than having it be final inspection, I really think it's not a good idea for your municipality. And then the other thing is, make sure you know how enforcement is handled. And if you are having problems on your CIP project with compliance, make sure you do get the CIP managers involved and you start having conversations. I was just recently out on a CIP project, and I thought the MS4 inspector did a great job. I was not there in that capacity. And they did a good job of separating themselves from the CIP manager, because sometimes pay items are not always approved. And so if as an MS4 inspector, you're saying, these are inadequate control measures, you're going to have to add control measures. And then the contractor saying, well, I'm not being paid by your municipality to add them, so I'm not going to add them. It becomes a very difficult situation. And, making sure they understand, look, that I don't control the pay items. What I control is compliance with the MS4 construction program. And that's my role and that's my job here. So I think that's really good. And then trying to create more dialogue with the CIP manager. I also encourage people to feel free to send CIP managers to that CIP stormwater compliance training, because it helps them to understand, what is expected for compliance. And I think it's really important for CIP managers to understand that, because again, they're co-permittees. And so not only are they co-permittees, but also the MS4 has a construction program, And it would not be okay for them to jeopardize the MS4 construction program for their CIP project. And so I think it's helpful to see the training and what is expected there. And then it's not just coming, like someone's not just making it up, that these are the expectations. So I'm sure we'll have another one of those trainings maybe towards the end of the summer. So just make sure you're communicating, you know, and doing your best to do that, even if others are not. And, you know, capital improvement projects are challenging. Again, I think if you can get in front of them as much as possible, it helps by introducing yourself, especially if you're there at the beginning of the project, and talking about expectations at the very beginning of the project and what your role is, can be very helpful. And that your role is not as a CIP manager, it's as the oversight construction compliance person. You know, the other thing that's hard, just be careful when you are an inspector, especially for those of us who have come from consulting background. Sometimes we want to help them and we want to totally, you know, be like, this is what you need to do to make your site in compliance. You can give some assistance, but you want to be careful about how far you go. Just like that quiz question about how much silt fence do I need? You know, if you went out there and you said, oh, I think you need like 30 feet, and then they come out there and they install it, and then you inspect it, and you're like, well, I'm sorry, you needed more like 50. You know, who's going to get the finger pointed at them? It's going to be you, right? So you do have to be really careful there. So I think you can be compliance assistant, you know, for sure. People don't always know. They don't know how do I measure this, you know, and you have to help them understand where they would look for resources, who to go to, that there are people that actually get paid to install the silt fence correctly. You know, maybe you could give them a couple of people you know about. I would avoid giving one name. I always, when people ask me for any kind of, you know, what kind of firm does this work, I try to give at least 3 names. And if you're a consultant, never your own. So that's important out there. Yeah, sometimes people will ask you, well, hey, thanks for that inspection. You said I looked pretty good. How would I do in a state inspection? You know, you're not a state inspector. You are a municipal inspector. And so you can only say from your perspective of your program, how it looked. So just be careful not to overstate. So the goals of the MS4 construction program are to minimize negative impacts. You know, we can't 100% eliminate them. I wish we could. But you know, when it rains, we're going to have probably some amount of sediment that does leave. But the idea is that we're not going to have muddy water, right? Like it's going to be sediment that is very minor and be representative of what would leave when it wasn't under construction. Then also we want to make sure that we're communicating not only to the people in the field, but also to other people that we work with, if that's the case. And even if you're a solo show, you know, you might be talking to maybe your public works director or your engineer director or community development directors if you're having issues out there. And then also, if you do work with a lot of other inspectors, you know, make sure you're being consistent with your program and how you're implementing the program out there. So I think that's always a good idea. And then I encourage you to talk to other inspectors, you know, come to that construction committee meeting, get with Ashley, she'll get you that information. It's a great place to bounce things off of each other. And especially as we go into the phase 2 permit renewal or for new, maybe not new, but non-standards that are now taking over their own programs and doing their own MS4 construction oversight, you know, making sure that you have other resources to bounce things off of to understand what the expectations are and what's working and what isn't. All right, here's some additional resources. I'm sure there are many others that I could put on here, but I really enjoyed doing this training with everybody. I appreciate the Colorado Stormwater Council for funding this type of training, and we're very lucky to have them. And I'm going to go ahead and email out everyone who attended today the exam, as well as a class survey. We'd love to have feedback, things that you would love to see. I wish we could go to the field. It's something we all, I think, that are involved with the development of this class would love to do. We just have not found a something that works logistically. Although I do think if CDOT ever opens up their BMP facility again, perhaps that's something we might think about. But love to hear feedback about the class if you like the two days instead of one. And then as far as the exam goes, as I mentioned, if you don't receive that exam, I'm going to go ahead and put my email. I thought it was on this last slide, but I don't see it. I'm going to put my email in the chat. You should also have it from the Zoom invites. Let me know. And then you do not have to return it until Friday. But you have about 25 minutes now still. So I think for some of you, you could get it done that quickly. So I'm going to let you go and get to it. But I appreciate having everybody in the class. And we'll try to work on maybe doing something in the field. That would just be, I think, fantastic. And I guess if you're interested in doing something in the field, maybe in your survey, just list if you think that would be a good idea, if that would be helpful for you. I know not all of us are located in the same area, but maybe we could get something in the Western Slope too, maybe something over here. Thank you, everyone.